Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Protector of the Fairies in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Protector of the Fairies. The Shadow of Acknowledge. His body shivering, Sting continued to stare at his old friend as he desperately tried to find the words to say. Rogue dash. My name is Acknowledge. He wanted to believe those words. It would have been better if he could. But the dragon's true human appearance did little to help. The hair was much longer than he remembered, but it was still the same shade as he remembered. One eye might have been damaged, but the other still had that same color to it, even if the light in it wasn't as bright as it once had been. Even the annoyed look was familiar. How many times had a similar expression being thrown at him in the past for one of the many stupid things he had done and dragged Rogue into? But there were differences too. Like how that annoyance had none of the same fondness that still would have been directed at him in the past. Like how the eyes seemed to narrow at him, never once softening and constantly viewing him as an enemy. And yet despite that it only created more similarities. He might not have ever faced Rogue as a true enemy, their old fights and spars could hardly count when there was little of these emotions behind them, but he had seen how Rogue dealt with those he disliked. He could see those same signs directed at him now, only magnified by so much hate that he truly wished this wasn't his friend. That's you, isn't it, Rogue? He muttered, unable to ignore the signs. No matter what Acknowledge said, it was only strengthening the sight before him. It's really you. I told you already, Acknowledge growled out in annoyance, that my name is Acknowledge. I looked for you, Sting muttered, hardly hearing Acknowledge's words of denial. Did you know that? Silence greeted him from the dragon, only making him chuckle half-heartedly as he remembered times Rogue had done that to him too. After the dragons attacked, we lost a lot of good mages. But at least we reclaimed their bodies. We could mourn them. But you weren't there. You realize dragons can eat your guide, do you not? They don't have to leave anything behind, Acknowledge shot out bitterly. So why don't you stop your foolish delusions and dash? I couldn't believe you were dead. Sting exclaimed out. I didn't want to, not until I saw proof. So I searched. And searched, and searched, and searched. I checked every inch of Crocus, and when that failed I moved on elsewhere. I checked the surrounding area, in case you had been dragged away during the battle and hadn't yet recovered. I told you dash. And even then I didn't stop. Sting screamed out, his emotions far past the point of being able to be bottled back up. The war began and there was still no sign of you. But I didn't give up. Maybe you had been taken by the enemy? Or maybe you were just staying away for some reason and were fighting elsewhere. Before I realized it, I was looking for you every time I fought. Every time I walked across those battlefields, I would scan the dead in case you were there. And you know what made that worse? Sting added weakly. Sometimes I even hoped to see you there, if only so I'd finally know. Because by that point I was starting to lose hope. Because there was no way you would have left it so long without at least trying to get into contact with me. Then why didn't you? Acknowledge asked mockingly. Your friend is dead. I should know. I was there when he died. I couldn't, Sting muttered, reaching into his shirt extremely slowly so he didn't make the man who was his friend attack him instinctively. Reaching around for the item he knew was always in there, he slowly pulled it out and let it unfold. It was nothing more than a scrap of cloth. Just bit of pink cloth with part of a black mark at one edge. It would mean nothing to someone if he showed it to them. It was nothing. That's. Except to one other person besides him and Lecter. Acknowledge's single exposed eye widened at the sight of the cloth in his hand. He had found it by chance in his search, one of the larger pieces scattered around a fairly large area. He had recognized it on instinct, because it was the same shade worn by the other who had disappeared that day. And while he had held out hope for his friend, he hadn't been able to keep it for his other. That was how he knew that the dragon before him could be no one else. This scrap of cloth meant nothing to anyone else. Even to him and Lecter it was merely important. But to Rogue, it would have meant everything. You recognize dash. He suddenly found it hard to believe when Acknowledge closed the gap before he had time to reach, grabbing him by the throat and squeezing hard enough that the words were snuffed out before they could be uttered. You dare show that to me? It really is, you, He barely managed to squeeze out. He supposed he was lucky that Rogue was angry at the sight of the piece of Frosh's old costume. The fact he was being held like this rather than gutted meant Rogue wasn't killing him yet at least. Get away from him. He heard someone roar, and then Natsu was there with one arm swinging out in a torrent of fire around his whole limb. The grip on his throat vanished in an instant as Acknowledge shot backwards across the air, narrowly dodging the stream of flames. Natsu made a move to continue his attack, to charge in once more, but he stopped him before he could by gripping onto his arm for dear life. Wait. He managed to gasp out between desperate breaths for the air he had lost. That's Rogue. He's also killed me who knows how many times. Natsu shot back up seriously, his flames still lingering along with his intentions. He's not your friend Sting. Please. Just let me try talking to him. Please. Natsu growled in frustration, but Sting didn't dare loosen his grip. He supposed he had to be thankful to the fact that Acknowledge hadn't moved from the spot he had retreated back to, and that no one else had attacked just yet. It seemed many of them were hesitating too, the dragons more than anyone else. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Natsu's flames became too dim until they barely lit up his skin. When he attacks again. Natsu left the warning hanging in the air, but he was thankful for even the smallest of chances to talk to his friend once more. Having seen the reaction to that piece of Frosh's old outfit too, he knew one thing for certain about what had happened that day. Frosh had died. There was little else that could have explained Acknowledge's vicious reaction to something that should only have had that level of significance to Rogue. And that meant there was no doubt that could be had anymore. This was his best friend. And they were standing at opposite sides of the battlefield. Why are you there, Rogue? He asked simply, using his magic to try and keep him steady in the air as he got closer. He didn't dare get too close, moving as far as he could until he saw Rogue begin to tense up warily, but he didn't want to be shouting all of this across the sky. I looked for you everywhere. But of all the places I expected to find you, I never once thought I'd find you on the opposite side to me. I certainly never would have thought you would ever try to kill any of us, nor look at us with such hatred. I thought I told you already. That you aren't Rogue. Sting glanced at his friend in disbelief. I saw how you reacted. Do you really think you can play dumb with me after that? You really think I can't recognize you? Call yourself what you will, but I know you're him. And you can't act like I don't either. Aren't we both smarter than that? So tell me, he begged. What happened to you? Where did you go? What happened? Are you that desperate to know what became of Rogue? Rogue shrugged, his face showing he found the idea off but was humoring them anyway. Very well. Consider it your last request of sorts. Your friend's tale started rather simply. Froze. That cat of his died. That is how it began. A tale that stems from loss. He knew it. He had known it from seeing how Rogue had reacted. But hearing it confirmed. It didn't make the knowledge any easier to hear. In his rage, Rogue tried to get vengeance. He lashed out, with all the power he could muster, but he failed. He couldn't deal the killing blow. He wasn't strong enough. No matter how much he wished it, the beast that took his dear friend from him was too powerful for him to overcome. It died in the end, but it wasn't by his hand. And after that his vision went dark. When he finally awoke once again, he was not where he expected to be. Rather than a hospital or even a ditch, he found himself in the one place he would never have considered even in his wildest dreams. He found himself 400 years ago, right in the peak of the Dragon's Civil War. Do you know what he saw when he first woke up? With one hand Rogue gestured around at the wasteland around them. It wasn't quite like this, but it shared one thing in common. It was empty, the result of a hard-fought battle between two sides that left nothing else standing. For when he woke up, merely being where he had lost everything and was left alone in an empty field. Protector of the fairies. Where am I? Muttered Rogue as he opened his eyes, tiredly rubbing the sleep away as he struggled to regain his bearings. He remembered. What did he remember? Something about a fight. About dragons. About. His eyes widened in horror as it all came flooding back to him, his hands gripping his body tightly as he shook. Frosh was. Frosh was. Frosh! He screamed out in despair, hugging himself tightly as he struggled to contain his sobs. His oldest friend was dead. There wasn't even a body to bury nor much else left. He could feel the scrap of cloth he had held from Frosh's old suit in his hands, dried blood coating one side of it, and it was the only physical proof left that Frosh had even existed. Everything else was merely memory, and those were more painful than anything else right now. It hurt. It hurt so much. Why did Frosh have to die? He was a soul far too innocent to deserve such a fate. He would have handed his own life over 100 times if it had meant sparing Frosh's, and yet in the end Frosh had let him go and saved him instead. There was no doubt Frosh's actions was kind. Frosh had saved him because that was the kind of person he was, too pure to even consider the idea of hurting anyone. And that made it hurt all the more, knowing that his own life was spared and such a pure being's was taken. He wasn't really sure how long he sat there crying for. Eventually he ran out of tears, but he still remained locked there, clutching at himself and the scrap of cloth like a lifeline. Only when hunger began to call to him and the light was setting did he finally look up again, noticing just how long had passed since he had broken down. The place he was at. He didn't recognize it. All around him was an expansive plain, land as far as the eye could see. But it was also all ruined. In some areas the ground was scorched black, the faint remains of trees littering the landscape in odd patches. In other areas the ground had collapsed, giant craters covering large expanses. Their shapes were oddly familiar though, and it took him a few moments to realize why. There were quite a few dragon-shaped imprints in the ground. What had happened here? How far from Crocus had he ended up? The crackling of a fire slowly caught his attention though, making him realize for the first time that he wasn't actually alone here. Turning his head, he had an apology already lined up on his tongue to the one who had been forced to see him in such a state until he met the other person's eyes. He couldn't have forgotten them even if he tried. They were the same eyes he had seen in a killer, one who had the means to take life with ease and could still talk about such trivial matters as if the act of doing so hadn't even affected him. "Hello," Ziraf said before him, sitting cross-legged by a small fire. A cooking pot appeared to be balanced precariously over it, with what he assumed was a stew of some kind cooking. Or at least it looked like what he briefly knew a stew should look like, except for the fact every piece of vegetable and meat had been cut onto extremely uneven proportions. "Are you hungry? I took the liberty of preparing something for the two of us to eat while you were." Ziraf trailed off hesitantly before glancing back at the meal. "Well, it should also be done, so if you are willing to wait a few moments we can dash." He didn't let the dark mage finish, lashing out with magic as quickly as he could. A wave of shadows left his palm, drawing strength from the darkness itself as they expanded in size as they shot forward, and left Ziraf blinking in shock before he saw the dark mage begin to move. His magic smashed straight into the dark mage as Ziraf rushed forward, and he heard a brief groan of pain after a moment before the shadows began to fade. He didn't dare let down his guard, preparing for his chance to flee when the dark mage returned strike. He was sure in that moment he'd have an opportunity to completely slip out of Ziraf's focus and flee through the shadows. Then he could regroup with the others once he found them and hope he could bring them back here in time. Those ideas however began to shatter when the shadows cleaned and revealed a surprised Ziraf, his arms spread out as if he had taken the blow head-on intentionally. He could see the dark mage slowly let out a sigh of relief as he turned his head to look over his shoulder, an action so odd to him. Why was Ziraf taking his eyes off him? Was he that confident in his own? "Ah, thank God," Ziraf said, pulling him out of his thoughts and seeing a small smile of sorts appearing on the dark mage's face as he turned back to him. "You really should be careful where you throw magic like that. You almost ruined our meal. You're worried about the stew?" Ziraf nodded, looking confused for a moment before a light seemed to shine in his eyes. "Ah, I forgot. I guess things have a tendency to slip one's mind after so long, and you really took your time waking up. Obviously you're a bit scared right now, but why don't we settle down for a bit first? Then we can talk about what's happened. Is that all right with you?" He wanted to say no. He didn't trust a single word coming out of his man's mouth, despite how earnest he seemed to look right now. He wanted to run away from all of this and find someone who could help him make sense of everything. But before he could do any of that, his stomach made up his mind for him. "All right," he reluctantly said, playing along with Ziraf's game for now before his stomach could rumble any louder. He hadn't eaten in some time, and he could at least hope the meal wasn't poisoned. If Ziraf wanted to kill him, the man must have had his fair share of opportunities so far. He couldn't risk letting his guard down though, staring at Ziraf while he waiting for the man to finish rooting around in that small rucksack he had near the rock that had been acting as a seat for him. 2 wooden bowls quickly came out, followed by a wooden spoon each before Ziraf carefully served out some of the stew to the both of them. Despite his stomach's protests, he held off eating to start with, merely watching Ziraf and waiting. The dark mage quickly seemed to catch on, even chuckling lightly before slowly raising his own spoon to his mouth and showing that the meal wasn't going to kill him. He didn't trust that massively, not when the man had to have some kind of immortality in the first place to have lived 400 years and still look as young as he did, but the lack of any immediately effects at least helped bury some of his worries. With them settled, he helped himself to the stew. He only meant to take few mouthfuls at most, but his hunger quickly became apparent, and before he realized he had devoured the entire bowl. "Hungry, I see," Ziraf said to him with a laugh. "Would you like some more? It's no trouble for me." He still wanted to say no, but nothing felt off from the meal for the most part. If anything, it was just odd. He could certainly call it stew, but the taste wasn't great. He was just that hungry. It became more apparent with his second bowl as his hunger began to vanish, leaving him to bear the brunt of the taste of it alone. "Apologize as if it's not that nice," Ziraf said, obviously having noticed something in his expression. Rather than get annoyed, however, the dark mage placed a hand on the back of his head as he laughed sheepishly. I honestly don't cook that often. The meat isn't really the freshest, and I found the rest at random from nearby areas. Plus I haven't really cooked in, well, quite a while, I'd say. If I'm being honest, I'm not even sure what day it is to check when I last eat either." "Why am I here?" he asked, unable to hold back the question any further. Ziraf looked at him oddly at that question, only furthering his frustrations as he shot out other words. "You brought me here for a reason, Ziraf. Why am I here?" "Ah," Ziraf muttered, and for a moment he thought the man looked sad. That was not an expression he expected to see on his face. "I thought it might have been this. I'd hoped your early reaction was merely a result of you being scared and afraid, but if you know my name too." "I asked you a question, Ziraf," he stated impatiently, his confidence growing slightly in the face of his far more uncertain Ziraf. "Why am I here?" "That's a tricky question. And one I'm not sure you'll like the answer to, I'm afraid. Can you tell me what happened to you?" "What happened?" "You were there." "That isn't surprising me right now," Ziraf muttered under his breath, so quiet that he was barely able to pick it up. "I hope things last the test of time then. Tell me, what do you know about the Eclipse Gate?" "The what?" The name sounded familiar, but not enough to get a clear idea of what Ziraf was on about. He thought he remembered something about a weapon, but the details got quickly forgotten when the dragons showed up and the royal family's plan went to hell. More difficult then. "All right, let's start with this then. How much do you know about time travel?" "Protector of the fairies." "Bullshit. Is Rogue's story so hard to believe?" Rogue asked him. "I honestly wouldn't say that it is. If anything, it should be easy to grasp. Except your description of Ziraf sounds a little off to me." Rogue sighed in frustration, sounding like he was getting tired of dealing with an unruly child. "Honestly, it seems none of you grasp the concept of time. People, even an immortal like Ziraf, never truly remain static. The Ziraf you know now was not necessarily the same back then. The Ziraf that Rogue met had yet to commit his atrocities. Rather, you could say he was at the beginning of his journey, still searching for what actions he would take and learning what methods were possible. Back then, one could even say he was still kind. And yet there's little doubt the reason you were sent back in time was because of Ziraf, was there not?" Acknowledge shrugged. Who can say who the original cause was for Rogue's experience of time travel? Maybe it was Ziraf, maybe it wasn't. At this point it hardly matters anymore, does it? If Rogue, Natsu started, appearing to Sting's eyes like he was playing along with Rogue's reluctantly to refer to himself by that name, was sent back in time, Would I be right in assuming it was a result of the eclipse gate? Ah yes, Acknowledge muttered. So some of you do remember that device. Correct. Rogue was unconscious when he was thrown in, and when he finally woke up he had drifted all the way to the first time the gate ever opened. Then why didn't he simply return that way? Natsu asked, pressing for an answer. I know it should be possible. People have traveled forwards and backwards as a result of that gate, so why couldn't he do it too? Or rather, why didn't Ziraf let him? Rogue scoffed. Back then, Ziraf would have allowed him to travel back if he could have done so. But the eclipse gate opened multiple times in those years, and only a few of them could be considered stable portals. Those few times were vastly outnumbered by the countless failures. Ziraf explained how he hadn't even had the faintest clue that anything was going to show up when he managed to get the gate working for the first time, let alone an actual person. Those were early days for the gate, Rogue elaborated. A pathetic power source that could barely keep it open for more than a few moments before it shattered, and a frame that could only occasionally hold the energy in the shape of a portal one could pass through, and even then it was no larger than a window. A far cry from the towering construct you all would have grown familiar with. That must have been one of the dozens of tests Ziraf had done and the first ever success, and he had no idea of when the next one would be. Rogue chuckled briefly in what Sting could only hope was bitter amusement at his past. So he waited. A day, a week, even a month, until it became apparent that little was going to change the situation he was in at that moment. He was stuck, 400 years in the past, without any way back to his friends or loved ones. His only companion was a man he knew to be the greatest evil to go down in history. He was truly alone, just waiting for a brief bit of hope. And that hope was like a curse, strangling what little life he had left in him. The day Rogue left was the day his soul began to shatter. Protector of the Fairies. Are you sure you don't want to stay? Rogue shook his head. I'm thankful for your hospitality. But you don't trust me, Ziraf finished for him with a bitter smile. A shame, but if that's the case. Well, I'll still be here for a bit longer if you change your mind. After another few days though I'll have to move. It's only a matter of time until some nearby dragon notices the sensation of this magic and comes to investigate. Can't you just kill it? He found himself saying, his viciousness surprising himself. The past month had left him feeling empty most of the time, and it was surprising to remember he could feel something else than just pain. Obviously it appeared to surprise Ziraf too, but it only took a few moments for the dark mage to recompose himself. Killing one of the beasts is, well, not too hard for me in all honest. They can't really do much to kill me, and I don't think any of them know that, which means they'd all expect me to die quite easily. It makes them easy to sneak up on and drain the life from, but killing them does create a problem that I don't want to deal with just yet. And that is the fact they'd notice. They'll naturally send out more, and if I want to keep my existence somewhat secret I'd need to kill them too. And if too many dragons die in such a short space of time, they are going to be asking questions. It's expected for that new king in the south to slay them with his arrows, or for that Shinigami of fire to roast them alive, but my methods are different. I'd be a new unknown, and nothing draws unwanted attention like that. Couldn't you just keep killing them? If they were just mindless beasts it would be the obvious course of action. But they aren't. They'd figure out a way to defeat and contain me. Just because they can't kill me, it doesn't mean they can't throw me in some dark hole and leave me to go insane over a few decades. I'd rather avoid that fate if I can help it. He nodded at that. Such a fate was not one he'd really wish on anybody. Death would probably be preferable after a few years of endless darkness and silence. He turned to leave before pausing briefly, a thought on his mind that forced him to turn back. If you managed to get the gate working. Not just for a rare moment but to actually make it stable. He trailed off, finding it hard to really ask for help from this man. But he didn't need to say anything else when it was obvious enough what he was after. A faint smile on his face, Ziraf nodded his head at his request. I can't guarantee when it might be, but I will try and find you one day once it manages to work. Consider it payment for your company this past month. For as suspicious as you have been of me, this has been one of the more pleasant conversations I have had in quite some time. I hope you find whatever you are looking for on your journey. He nodded in turn, desperately hoping that he would. In truth, he had little reason to leave. Once Ziref finished the gate, it would be faster if he was with him to get home. But the thought of staying by Ziref's side for that uncertain length of time was unsettling. He had tried to treat this Ziref as a separate person to his future self, but it wasn't easy. This Ziref was kinder and didn't deserve his hate, and yet was bearing with it anyway with what he believed looked like experience. It was why he couldn't stay. He couldn't continue to treat him this way, nor could he just wait there aimlessly and watching every single failure of the Eclipse Gate. Each one already felt like a knife through the heart, destroying another piece of hope that he had managed to cling to. Maybe if he traveled somewhere he could at least find something to help keep him looking forward. He doubted it would be easy though, and he realized how right he was a few days later as he trudged his way through the rain. His clothes were already soaked through and part of him knew he should be seeking shelter and trying to dry off. But it was hard to even care. With every step he hoped to find something to make him feel alive. But the only thing he felt was pain. With each step he felt like he was getting further and further away from ever returning home. The faces of Sting and the others had initially been a lifeline, but now the memories were beginning to weight him down, crushing him under the pain he felt from them. He half wondered what the point of any of this was. Was it even worth waiting for Ziref to finish his Eclipse Gate? He had no idea when that could be. Based off what he had been told, he could assume the dragons that had attacked Crocus had come from the gate, which meant there was a moment in time where there would be a stable portal. But when even was that if the current attempts barely maintained a window-sized portal if Ziref was lucky? Would he have to wait a year? 2? Or maybe it would be more like 10 or 20. That time he was sure would be nothing for Ziref, but for him? That would be like an eternity of walking aimlessly, weighed down by only despair. A loud roar echoed above him, and it took him a moment to recognize it for what it was. A dragon's roar, and once again he found himself feeling that emotion from before. Hate. If the members of his friends reminded him of everything out of his reach, the member of Frosh reminded him of everything he had lost. The former weighted him down and made him struggle to move forward, but the latter? That made him feel alive for the first time in days. His eyes glanced up in time to see the massive form of a dragon fly across the sky, its form wavering as it tried to keep its position high up there. It looked like it was bleeding from one of its wings, going by the large wound he could see even from this distance. Ziref's warnings ran through his head heavily, but he didn't heed them. For this moment, he wanted to actual live again, even if just for a moment. If acting on his rage did that, it was fine. The magic he was used to answered his call, shadows pooling at his feet and helping him move quickly across the land as he kept pace with the dragon's slow descent. He waited patiently, right until it was about to land, before he finally struck. He let loose all of his anger with a single blow, letting his magic sharpen the shadows to a razor edge and tear straight through the wound on its wing, severing it from its body. The dragon let out a massive cry of pain, falling that last little bit to the ground, and he used that chance to leap up onto its back, magic circling his palm once more as he mixed some of Sting's magic into the mix and let his strength skyrocket. Then, without listening to the dragon's attempts to tell him something, he plunged his hand straight down against its head and unleashed the blast point blank. When the energy he'd unleashed finally cleared, the dragon had stopped moving and his fist was still pressed against where he had managed to cave in flesh. The feeling of blood across his knuckles was odd, but it was one he enjoyed right now, a smirk slowly growing on his face as he felt the first bit of joy that he had done in weeks. And then it all vanished as he realized what he had done and the anger faded. This dragon hadn't been attacking anyone that he knew of. It had tried to speak to him before he killed it. What if it had been on the side of humans in the dragon's civil war? His anger wasn't at those dragons but the dragons that killed and eat his kind for fun and sport. And yet in that moment earlier, he hadn't cared. He had been too busy reeling in the joy of acting on his anger and succeeding. It sickened him. He hated the fact he had felt good from his actions, and now he only felt emptier than before. What would Sting think if he could see him now? Or Lecter? Or Gajeel? Worst, what would Frosh think of him? Slowly climbing down off the dragon's body, he continued to force himself to walk away and back through the rain, continuing his journey to wherever his feet would take him and swearing to himself that he would not make the mistake he had today and succumb to his desire for vengeance. He lasted only a day. Protector of the fairies. You're lying. Oh. Rogue said curiously, glancing at the bright form of Vislaja up above. It appears even the dragons seem to doubt me. And, pray tell me, what makes you a better judge to tell if this story is correct or not? I've seen the boy through Sting's memories. And I know Skyadrum would have stepped in to help given enough time. He would have stopped him from going any further down that path. I wouldn't be so sure, Rogue shot back. You see, I murdered Skyadrum when that dragon did show up. Until that day, Skyadrum was nowhere to be found. Considering how long you all hide for, I expect he couldn't show up. That left your precious child's friend to suffer all alone, with his only pleasure being in the slaying of dragons. He was quite like me in those moments. A shame he continued to be unable to let everything else go. How many times did he kill? Sting asked quietly, Rogue turning to him quickly with a smirk. Oh. So you believe me at least. How many? Rogue shrugged, looking unbothered by his lack of knowledge. I don't know. And I don't care. Whenever he felt so low he would inevitably seek out a dragon to kill. And when he had done the deed he would drop back down to an empty state. He did it so many times that you could compare him to a junkie, chasing after his next fix to feel even anything else apart from pain. So when did Ziref's words come back to bit him in the arse? Gajeel called out from his dragon armor. When did the dragons retaliate? How amusing that you immediately assume that. None of us are idiots here, Laxus called out himself. Ziref's words in that story were obviously a warning to Rogue as much as they were about himself. And if Rogue started hunting down dragons, it would only be a matter of time until other dragons notice that some of their numbers keep going missing. So? What happened? It's simple, Rogue stated, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. They did what they always did to threats beneath them. They attacked. Rogue was skilled but he was no Waiwak or Yamamoto. He wasn't recognized as a force that warranted an avoid-at-all-costs order, and he wouldn't have gotten one anyway even after their encounters with him. They began fairly simply in their methods, Rogue explained, sending out a dragon or two extra. Nothing major at first but those dragons didn't return either, picked off one by one. So they sent out a few more to scout and only one of them eventually returned, speaking of a human who had cut down their brethren and how he'd only escaped by remaining unnoticed. Those told immediately recognized Rogue for what he was. A dragon slayer. They were still a relatively new thing at this point but none of them had yet proven to be as successful as Rogue was being. And that itself warranted action since in their eyes it was obvious he was a threat. So in the end, a larger group was sent out. There must have been. 10 of them maybe. Rogue took a moment to pause, as if having to struggle to remember. Sting wondered for a moment if Rogue even remembered how many he had killed amidst all the dragons that had fallen by his hands. Correction. 8. The other 2 were already dead when the 8 arrived. There was no talking involved. There couldn't be when he was standing on the corpse of one of the friends, with the corpse of another lying with its arm torn off. Rogue let himself smile as he continued to tell the tale, looking like he was quite fond of the battle. I have to admit, even I would be impressed. 8 dragons, all high on bloodlust, against a single dragon slayer who had already fought 2 dragons not long before. Almost everyone told this tale would assume that the winner would be the dragons, and I would be almost tempted to believe it too. But that day Rogue fought like a demon. If the dragons had attacked during the day things could have gone different, but at night. Rogue's smile quickly turned predator as he spread his arms out wide. At night, they might as well have been fighting the air. His body shifted from physical to incorporeal. Shadows were his magic and in the darkness he could avoid almost everything they threw his way. Claws that meant to slice him open instead passed through a solid shadow, leaving the physical body unharmed, and in return he could slip past their best attempts to defend themselves. Whether he appeared right before them and gave them no room to dodge or he snuck out from their blind spots and let loose his magic, the end result was that he struck blow after blow down on them. Of course, for all his strength and skill he did lack one thing, Rogue added. Magic. The more he used, the less he had. Killing the first 5 dragons took time, and by the time he had done so he was already running low and had a large gash across his chest from the 3rd dragon he had killed, unable to avoid the last-ditch attack from the beast before it perished by his hands. Taking down the sixth cost him mobility in his left leg, and he barely managed to kill the seventh while dealing with the dizziness coming from his blood loss. He stood little change when the last attacked, losing his left arm entirely when it was torn from his body by the dragon's jaws. Rogue paused briefly, shooting a look at the dragons surrounding him. "Your kind was always arrogant, you know?" The dragon knew it had been outmatched earlier. It should have capitalized on its momentum, but instead it stopped to gloat. To taunt. While it was eating Rogue's arm, Rogue forced shadows into a makeshift limb and sharpened them into a deadly spear, one that quickly found its way through the dragon's jaw from below and gave him time to finish the job with one final spell. Victory was his, Rogue stated. Rogue won, but he was also dying. And Rogue was tired. The high of killing those dragons faded quicker with each kill, and by the time he finished the job with the 8 he barely felt anything but a brief moment of relief. Then it was back to pain, both physical and emotional. He was bleeding out, from his leg, chest, and missing arm, and he had little magic left to stop that even if he had the ability to do so. He could have tried to bandage his injuries as best as he could, but right then he saw little point of it. So he began to walk once more, continuing on his aimless path. Each step brought him closer to death. With each step he began to resist the source of his pain less and less. He had nothing. He would have nothing. What point was there to an empty life like that? He simply wanted it to end, but was too weak to perform the deed himself. So he let the dragons do it for him. Each step only helped him bleed out faster, and pretty soon he was lying in the dirt in a growing pool of his own blood. He had given up everything, Rogue muttered. He had nothing left to live for. And in that moment, that was when she appeared. The sun that shone down on his life, and signaled the beginning of his end. Protector of the fairies. When his eyes opened, he couldn't help but be confused for a moment. He hadn't expected them to ever open again when he had collapsed. He even felt disappointed that they had done. Finally he might have been free of this pain, and yet it seemed he wasn't allowed that just yet. He had to suffer a bit longer until the next time he fell. Oddly though, he could tell something was off. For starters, he was looking up, not down. He had fallen face first into the dirt. He even remembered tasting it in his mouth when he had crashed against it after his legs had given out. So why was he looking up at a rocky ceiling instead? His bed was different than before too. Rather than the wet ground, softened by his own blood, he could feel some uneven rocks if he ran his hand against the ground, along with the sensation of fabric of some kind. He tried to press up from it with his other hand. Only to realize it wasn't there. Ah! He had forgotten. It was gone now. Not that it mattered much. Losing it didn't come close to the pain from losing everything else. Dealing with a single arm would be trivial in comparison. What about his other wounds though? He glanced down at himself to see one of his pant legs pulled up with the lower half wrapped carefully in cloth. His chest meanwhile had been completely exposed, his top gone and replaced by the cloth that covered the wound across his chest and covered where his arm had been ripped from. Where had all of this come from? The cloth on his chest looked different from that on his leg, and he faintly ran his hand along it, tugging lightly at the edge when a voice stopped him from going any further. "I wouldn't pull at it." He glanced over to the source of that voice, noticing the form on light brown-haired girl sitting by a small fire. She glanced over at him briefly, piercing blue eyes continuing to stare until he dropped his hand, and then they quickly turned away back towards the fire. "Thank you." He nodded briefly, taking in her appearance. She was shivering a bit, even next to the fire, and had her knees pulled against her. Her clothing really didn't seem appropriate for the current season. From what he had been able to tell, it was settling into winter, getting colder with each day, so her short dress was hardly appropriate. Except it wasn't short, he realized as he noticed the tears near its end, the material it was made of becoming familiar as he glanced back at his injured leg. The cloth around his chest too looked like it could have been part of a top of some kind. Perhaps a blouse or a cardigan that had been keeping her warm in current days. "I didn't have much on hand," he heard the girl say over to him, his eyes meeting hers as he turned back to find her staring at him again. "It's not much, but..." "It's fine," he quickly assured he, receiving a small nod in response. Good. I would have taken you back to my village first, but you're heavy. How did you find me? He asked curiously. I would have thought most people would have stayed away when dragons were nearby. So you did fight them, the girl muttered to herself, nodding her head briefly as she confirmed her suspicions. You were quite close and I couldn't see any other signs that anyone else had been there. If the dragons had killed themselves it would have been a very different sight, and normally one of them would have survived anyway and flown off. That doesn't answer my question. I suppose it doesn't, came the girl's response. I was nearby at the time when I heard the dragons. So I ran into the bushes and hid, waiting for the noises to finally stop. I was going to leave when the noises stopped, but I got curious when they did and there was no sign of a victor. And so you thought it was a wise idea to approach? He asked sarcastically. If dragons are even nearby, you should run away as far as you can. I don't think you should give advice that you aren't willing to follow yourself, the girl retorted with. I saw the bodies before I found you. I don't think I've even seen a dead dragon that wasn't killed by one of its own kind. I fully expected you to be a monster of some kind before I saw you. Gee, thanks. In current days I don't think being a monster would be too bad. You'd be safer at least. That doesn't make it any better. The girl shrugged. Anyway, I saw you lying there. The rest is history. That's it? A man somehow killed 10 dragons and is dying and your first response is to go save him? I could have been just as deadly to you as they were. I had faith you weren't. And if I was to kill you right now? He asked, purposefully showing her a bit of magic as he shaped it threateningly in front of her. He couldn't say he was thankful for what she did. And he knew she acted out of kindness. That was why he had to do this, else her kindness might one day get her killed. If he had been dangerous, she'd be regretting it now. How would you even stop me? You won't. And how do you know? The girl trailed off briefly, turning away to look at the fire. He let his magic fade away after a few moments and let out a sigh. See? If you can't be sure then dash. I have magic too. He paused at that. If she had magic. So even if I had been a threat, you could have defended yourself? Is that what you're saying? If she believed herself strong enough to defeat him, she was either that confident in her abilities or he was that weak at the moment. Probably the latter, since her magical power wasn't that noticeable in comparison to the mages back home. No offense, but aren't you ever estimating yourself a bit? The girl shook her head, however. My magic isn't for fighting. I don't know who I inherited it from, but from an early age I've been capable of seeing the life of people. It mostly helps me find people, but as I've gotten older I've found I can determine how trustworthy someone is by explaining that life I see. I believe I can peek into their soul in that regard. And you looked into mine and decided to heal me. The girl nodded. Yes. Why? She tilted her head briefly, appearing surprised at his response. Why wouldn't I save you? You didn't seem like a bad person. Wouldn't anyone save them if they could try? You must have seen what's in my soul, he muttered out in response. Even if only a look on the surface, you must have seen my pain. Why let it continue? It would have been kinder to put an end to it. I see. She paused briefly before asking him the question he was sure had been burning on Ziref's mind in their brief time together. Do you wish to die? Yes. Why? You saw my soul. That should be enough to know. The girl shook her head, however, looking uncertain at his response. I can get an idea. I don't know everything. But you saw pain. Yes. Then you saw it all, he shot back. That's all there is left. Pain. Pain from losing everyone I cared about. Pain from an uncertain hope of ever returning. Pain from the actions I've taken and the brief joy I gained from them. In the end, I'm just walking around until I die. All you've done is push back the inevitable. Is that so? The girl looked at him oddly for a moment. I saw pain. But I saw hope too. I told you that your hope brings you pain. She nodded. Yes. But you wouldn't cling to it so strongly if you weren't sure it was possible, right? So that gives you one reason already to keep living, doesn't it? And what if it never gets answered? I can't answer that. But if all you have is pain, then you merely need to find something else to treasure. Something else to treasure? The idea was ludicrous. Everything he cared about was 400 years away from him. Like what? He asked, hating how desperate he sounded for that lifeline she was offering. What is there to even find? A purpose? A duty? She shrugged slightly before smiling at him for the first time. It felt like everything had frozen in that moment, her words reaching him in a way giraffes had failed to do so. But for now, how about a friend? My name is Sonia. What is yours? He almost forgot to respond as he stared at her, lost in that smile. Rogue Cheney, he muttered out softly, unable to tear his eyes away. Looking back, he knew this would always be the moment he fell in love with this girl from the past. Protector of the fairies. That doesn't sound like a bad end, Grandini spoke softly. Falling in love is always the birth of something new. What ends is necessary for this? Perhaps, Rogue replied carefully, his eyes glaring at her. However, sometimes love can become more dangerous than anything else. Especially for one with nothing. Turning away from her, Rogue focused his attention back on Sting. Your friend had nothing. No one left he could trust and rely on, and with hope that was more like a curse than a blessing. What do you think would happen if suddenly a brief ray of light was shown deep into that darkness? I'd latch onto it, Sting replied immediately, before his eyes widened as he took in the implications of those words. Latch onto it. She became his everything, didn't she? Rogue nodded, and for a brief moment Sting was sure he could see another emotion flash in the man's eyes. Fondness. Sonia wasn't ugly, nor was she beautiful. She wasn't rich, nor was she poor in regards to her family. She was a normal girl who in the current age could pass by you quite unremarkable. But she was kind. Saw things in others they couldn't remember or see themselves and could reach out to them to help. She always loved doing that. It was no wonder that she looked so beautiful to Rogue. He became captivated by her. By saving him from his despair, she became the sun in his life. The very thing that gave him reason to move forward each and every day. She took him back to her village, Rogue continued. Had her family take him in for a few days until he started venturing out and trying to pull his own weight. Within a week, everyone in the village knew him by name. Within a month they had come to trust him. Those that could use magic were either distrusted or adored, and the fact he was willing to help them made them treat him like the latter. A few months later and he realized his feelings. He and Sonia began to spend more and more time together with each passing day, and finally he began to see a future again. He begged her father for permission to ask for her hand in marriage and crafted her the most beautiful ring in the world. Rogue paused briefly. Sting didn't miss how his gaze seemed to shift away from him, as if the man was lost in memory as he spoke. A shine as dark as the night itself, created from his own magic over days and days of forcing it into a hardened shape that could stand the test of time. She never understood the full implications of the gift when he presented it. It was beautiful to her, but rings didn't yet have the meaning they do nowadays. But she treasured it anyway. I remember that day, Rogue stated, for the first time referring to himself as he spoke. Sting didn't dare say anything to break the state Rogue was in, not after hearing one of the words he had wanted to be confirmed. Not even if he wanted to ask why the very ring that had been described to him was on Rogue's left hand. I had waited until twilight to ask her. I'd go over half a different spots until I had managed to find the perfect one. The way her face lit up, the way she smiled at me. I hadn't wanted that day to end, but for the first moment in a long time I hadn't been afraid of what the next might bring. As quickly as the moment came though, the look of his friend was gone and replaced by the cold look of before. Time passed in bliss for Rogue. They got married, moved into a place of their own, and for a time life was peaceful. A few more months had nearly passed and they learned she was with child. Suddenly the world seemed brighter again to Rogue. But the world can be cruel. His life was like a wonderful dream, and that dream came to an end a little over 18 months after it began. Protector of the fairies. Rogue's eyes slowly cracked open, groaning a bit in annoyance as he tried to ignore the sounds of banging against the door for a few more moments. Rogue. Go get it. He heard Sonia mutter tiredly beside him, pulling the covers over her ears as she tried to drown out the sound and fall back into the blissful abyss of sleep. He gave a small grunt of acknowledgement as he forced his tired body up from his best, carefully leaning against the wall for support as he gained his bearings. His eyes adjusted quickly to the darkness and his magic aided it further, helping guide him as he made his way around the room and avoided a few of the obstacles littered in his path. He paused only briefly to grab a discarded cloak and pulled it around his shoulders, using it to try and fight off the cold chill of the night. "Hold on," he called out as he moved out of the room and closer towards the door. The place they lived in wasn't large by any means, so normally his voice would have traveled fairly well, though with all the banging the person outside was doing he wasn't sure if he was even heard. Before he was even at the door, however, his mind began to think the worst. Was this a trap? Was there an enemy out there? The likelihood was low. People generally liked him in the small village, but it could have easily been outsiders trying to lure him into a trap. If they had, doing it at night would be a big mistake. He let his magic expand out as he continued his approach to the door, the shadows extending out and mapping out everything they touched. Finding cracks and holes to crawl through, they easily spread outside and expanded away from his home, counting out every major life form he could sense within them. 2 people. Either others were hiding outside of his range or these were all there was. It would have been nice if he could have determined who they were from this, but this kind of magic wasn't very good at identifying people. He needed to know a lot about the person to recognize them with merely shadows, and the only person he could manage that for was resting behind him. Still, 2 people wasn't something he couldn't deal with if they turned out to be hostile. He hadn't fought in some time now, but his skills had hardly dulled. He opened the door carefully, subtly gathering magic at his feet as he gripped the door handle with his solitary hand, and as a bit of light spilled in from the outside he prepared to strike. "Ah, thank God, you finally answered." And with those words he immediately let the magic disperse when he recognized the young man in front of him, a hand still raised as if meaning to strike the door again. The other had a lantern held a little too close to his face for comfort, especially with how accustomed his eyes had already gotten to the darkness. "Rinyai, is this important?" he asked wearily. Once he had proved his worth in the village and they had gotten over any initial distrust they had of him, a lot of people had come to him for help because of his magic. It was why seeing this man in front of him didn't surprise him too much. The time, however. "It's really late and I'm tired, so if this can wait until morning dash." "It can't," Rinyai stated urgently, enough to make him properly look at the man. Rinyai was young. Younger than he was, though was always trying to act tougher whenever someone brought up his age. The fact he had so much energy and life to his eyes though didn't help his claims. He was still a kid. That was why the sight of him now was enough to force him awake. Rinyai didn't look like he had slept properly in a few days now going by his face, and the fear plastered across it was very different than the expressions the kid normally wore. "What's wrong?" he asked seriously, taking the moment to glance beside Rinyai briefly at where he realized the second presence was. "Is that Dash?" "My father," Rinyai stated urgently, noticing that he had seen the much older man leaned up against the side of the house. "Please, you need to help him." He didn't say a word as he swept past the young man, crouching down beside the old man and letting his eyes roam over him. Raising his hand he allowed shadows to spread forth across the man's body, going slowly so Rinyai didn't freak out from the display. His magic was helpful at probing the surface of the man's body for any injuries, but he couldn't find any. "His breathing is abnormal," he noted, cutting off his magic and raising his hand instead to the man's head and feeling his temperature. "He's hot too. And his pulse." He quickly brought his hand down to the man's neck before letting out a sigh. "Erratic. Why did you bring him to me? You can help him, right?" "Ah." The question he had grown to really hate. How many people had come to him saying those same words in the past? "My magic is that of shadows," he stated calmly, trying not to get annoyed. He was just glad he had been vague when he first spoke about it and had left out the fact it was capable of killing dragons. He would have had even more problems if he reckoned. Not every magic is capable of healing people just because they know magic. That's rare even among us mages. "But, isn't your magic linked to death? And who, pray tell me, told you that ridiculous idea?" he muttered, not really expecting an answer. It was probably a case of person A told person B, and by the time it reached the last person it had become so disjointed that it no longer was connected to truth. Besides, even if I had that kind of power, there would still be no guarantee I could have saved him. Best I could have done would have been to speed up the process, not reverse it. But you're a mage. There's got to be something you can do. I'm sorry, kid, he muttered. How long has he been like this? Ringyai had to pause for a moment, briefly counting out the days with his fingers. I think it was 8 days now? I'm not too sure when it started, to be honest, but that's when he took a turn for the worse. The medicine we made hasn't been helping either, and Mother thinks he doesn't have long left for this world at this rate, he muttered, knowing very well what the kid's mother probably thought. Damn. Have you checked around the village? Is there anyone else who can spare some help? Ringyai shook his head rapidly. No one. We tried borrowing some stuff to help 2 days ago, but it hasn't done anything either. This was bad. With how small their village was, they didn't have a proper doctor. The best they had was a small medicine maker, and she normally just made things when she had some spare time unless it was urgent. It would help with minor stuff, but whatever the kid's father was suffering from was not easily curable. They did, however, occasionally get guests passing through. Their village was suited nicely on the route between 2 larger villages, and luckily neither had been destroyed yet, so it meant traffic was still strong between the two from time to time. And if memory served, a doctor, or what equated for one in this time period, had been passing through. Do you remember the man that came through the village around 2 weeks ago? Ringyai frowned but gave a slow nod. Yeah. I remember him speaking to my father briefly. A flame seemed to light in the young man's eyes briefly from anger. You don't think he did something, do you? Probably noticed something was up with your father more than anything else, he pointed out, the anger in Ringyai's eyes slowly calming at his words. Maybe he gave him a bit of advice or wanted to help. Your father is stubborn though, so he probably wouldn't have accepted any until it actually became a problem. So he might be able to help. Maybe, he muttered. It was giving the kid some false hope, but well, even he wanted to cling to it. If it had been Sonia in his place, he was sure she would have tried to help the man. What kind of person would he be if he didn't live up to that example? There's only one way to find out. Tell your mother not to worry. I'll take your father to get some help. Some help? Do you know where the man is? If I'm lucky, the next village, he stated. He stayed around these parts briefly, and in a village the size of the next one I'm sure he'll have plenty of work to have him still there. If I move quickly I can probably catch him before he moved again. I can't risk waiting to bring him back with me though, so I'll need to take your father with me. But that's at least 3 days away by foot. How will you even dash? Putting on a smile, he placed a hand reassuringly on the young man's shoulder. Don't worry. My magic might not be good for healing, but it will at least get me where I need to go quickly. I'll have him there before dawn breaks. You can guarantee it. He didn't expect the young man to slam into him, pulling him a hug and crying out his thanks multiple times. There was a smile on Ringyai's face when he pulled back, one that remained even as the young man rushed back to his home to alert his mother and tell her not to worry. Sighing to himself as he turned back towards the kid's father, he carefully pulled the man up, using his shadows to help support the man's weight until he was completely slung over his shoulder like a sack. It certainly wasn't the easier way to carry someone so ill, but with one arm he could only do so much. Briefly glancing into his shared home, he called out a brief farewell to Sonia, letting her know he had to head out, before hearing a small acknowledgement in response before she fell back to sleep. Smiling to himself at her antics, he closed the door carefully with some shadows before turning his attention towards the way he needed to go. And then he moved, stepping into shadows and moving through them. Like that, he wasn't bound by the same limitations that would have plagued the other villagers. He could take the most direct route possible to his destination at a far greater speed. Unfortunately, he couldn't forget about his passenger. At regular intervals he kept stepping back out of the shadows he was moving through and making sure the kid's father was still doing a go. The last thing he wanted was for his magic to negatively influence the man's condition and kill him quicker. By the time dawn started to break though, he had finally made it. Just in time too, as with the rising sun the distance he could travel shortened drastically without the blanket of night allowing him unrestrained access to whether he wished to go. Luck happened to be on his side too, and he managed to catch the doctor, with a day to spare from the looks of it. The doctor made mention of having planned to leave soon, obviously intending to head to his next stop and find people to treat there. The doctor happened to recognize the man he had brought to, and within no time at all a cure was being made and administered. He found it odd sometimes how fast some of these medicines could work in these current times. The people of his era could be struck down by all sorts of things, but one of the biggest killers was illnesses, many of which had been cured long ago in his time. He guessed this was one of those cases, where the medicine was already available by skilled practitioners but lacked the method to distribute it to the wider world beyond traveling around to do so manually. As he waited outside hours later, darkness having fallen once more, he smiled briefly as the doctor told him the good news about how the man would make a full recovery within a few more days. It would keep him away from Sonia for a bit longer than he wanted, but it would be best to keep the man here until he had fully recovered, else he'd run the risk of a relapse and this time not have the medical help he would need. And then suddenly all those peaceful thoughts shattered with the roar that echoed through the sky. He felt his body freeze in place as a massive dragon soared over the village, heading off into the distance with a large group following behind it. He counted the seconds as each passed, locking down on every bit of magical power he had in trying to make himself as invisible as possible. He continued this until the last dragon was finally off in the distance, vanishing into the horizon. Only then did the old itch to kill retreat away, leaving him with pure relief that he hadn't acted on it. This wasn't the first time since he had seen a dragon since he met Sonia. Many had passed over their village from time to time, though always in small numbers of 2 or 3. They simply got ignored, but each time he had to fight down on his bloodlust that demanded their deaths. Sonia had been good at helping with that, holding him until they were gone and then acting like he hadn't been struggling with a desire to kill each and every dragon he could find. Still, he hadn't seen that many dragons since that night long ago when they almost killed him. Whenever dragons gathered in large numbers, it was never a good omen. "Dangerous beasts, aren't they?" he heard the doctor mumble beside him. "Someone really should put a stop to them. Around a few months ago I found one of my usual stops entirely destroyed, and that was a villager about twice as big as this one. God, I hope they don't come back this way." "They looked like they were in a rush," he stated, trying to be calm about the whole situation. "Whatever they're after is far away from here." "There aren't many things down that path though," the doctor muttered. "Suppose there's some old cities long since destroyed. 1 or 2 of them might matter to some of the good dragons. Though I worry for whoever lives that way." "Yeah. Me, too. That direction, wasn't his home that way?" A chill went down his spine. Going by how quickly they were rushing, he doubted the dragons had their eyes on such a small and insignificant village like his own. But if they stopped there on the way, if they decided to go for a snack or just fight there and then. "Can you stay in town until I return? With the man you brought in I would need to for at least another 3 days minimum in case his condition weakens at any point." "Why? You heading somewhere?" "My village is that way." He didn't need to see the doctor's face to know it had gone pale. I see. Godspeed." "Thank you. I'll return as soon as I can." He didn't have time to spare any more words. His magic responded to his will and then he was off, moving through shadows without pause. Without having to worry about a passenger, he was free to maintain this form without worry, moving as fast as he could. The problem was that he had yet to see a single dragon. They had to be flying as fast as they possibly could for him to have not caught up at all, and he could barely sense them in the distance. Where were they going? Where would they stop? He prayed to every god he had ever heard of that they wouldn't go to the one place he desperately hoped they wouldn't. "Don't take her away from me," he muttered under his breath. "Please don't. Not her. I can't lose her." He stumbled out of the shadows near the edge of his village, leaning against a tree for support as he tried to catch his breath. He felt exhausted. He didn't think he had ever traveled somewhere this far so urgently before, and he desperately needed a moment to rest. He would have taken longer, but he froze when he saw the destruction. It wasn't clear from this distance, but he could distinctively make out the shape of houses that didn't look the same shape as they had before. Some places even appeared to be missing homes. The dragons were here though. They were circling in the sky, like vultures looking for prey, and that sight alone terrified him. Some were even on the ground as well, looking through houses for something. For once his bloodlust was silenced by another emotion, his fear for Sonia's life overwhelming everything else. He couldn't simply walk down there though. If the dragons saw movement they'd pounce on him in an instant. If it broke down to a fight too, he honestly wasn't sure how well he'd do against so many. There was twice as many as those he fought last time, and 3 of them were twice the size of all the others too. They felt more like the dragon that had killed Frosh so long ago now, and he knew if he couldn't kill one of that level then killing 3 would be impossible. And then there was his own condition. He didn't just lose an arm. His leg had never fully healed. He could manage small distances fine, but it became apparent whenever he traveled through shadows or tried to exert himself too much that he had a tendency to stumble, his leg not able to fully support him when he applied too much pressure to it too quickly. He had to sneak in. The shadows would hide him, as they always did. Slipping back into them he snuck across the land while it was still dark. There wasn't long till dawn, and if he acted quickly enough he could be in and out before they were any the wiser. With every second that passed though, his fear rose. He passed by house after house, destroyed from claws or magic. He didn't miss the bodies either ripped apart or left for dead. So when he finally reached his own home, he feared the worst. Don't be dead, don't be dead, don't be dead dash. He snuck in beneath the door, reforming in the edge of a doorway to their shared room only to find the wall behind it torn away. He didn't see Sonia though, and that was reason enough to check elsewhere. A quick check confirmed she wasn't anywhere else in the house, and he wasn't sure whether to be relieved he hadn't found her body or worried because he didn't know if she was safe or not. The sound of growling forced him to hide quickly, ducking behind his ruined bed and carefully watching as a dragon began to walk past, chewing on the body of a poor soul as it did so. He wanted to avenge them but he didn't have time. Sonia was in danger so he needed to. All thoughts ground to a halt as he saw an arm fall from the dragon's mouth, landing on the ground beside it as it walked on past. It hadn't even noticed, and for a moment he would have ignored it too. Except even in this darkness his eyes had been more than capable of making it out. The form of a ring, holding a gem with the shine of the night sky itself. He could never forget that ring. He had made it for her. So many failures had happened and so many attempts had shattered that he had almost given up on it. But he had wanted to make it perfectly. If had to be perfect, because she deserved nothing less. Since the day he had given it to her, she had never once taken it off. He had seen her smile at times when she looked at it, and there were times he was sure she would have loved it even if it hadn't been made as beautifully as it had been. The fact it was both only made it even more precious. That ring never left her hand. And it appeared it hadn't even in death. His vision turned red, and by the time the dragon had turned to see what had caused the disturbance it found his hand shot straight into its gut, shattering the scales in its way. He didn't even bother trying to kill it quickly. It didn't deserve it, and so he pulled forth all the strength he could to muster the shadows around him to his side. Together he ripped open the dragon's chest, blood spilling against him as he plunged his hand into the dragon's still beating heart. The dragon fell against him lifelessly within moments, his form breaking apart and reforming from shadows as he pulled open the dragon's mouth. What he saw made that rage break apart in place of one single feeling. Despair. She was there. Her mangled body was covered in wounds, courtesy of the dragon's teeth. Even as he pulled her out, he knew she hadn't been dead long. She was still warm. Had she been alive when the dragon started to chew on her? How long had she suffered for? How long had she needed to? Why had he gone last night? He hadn't even had a chance to say a proper goodbye. He was meant to be back to find her safe, merely curious at what had been the issue the previous night or few nights ago. Not this. Never this. He couldn't help but scream out in pain, pulling her closer as his tears began to fall. Sonia. 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 Why? Why did this have to happen to her? This whole village could have been destroyed, but if she had lived he would have been fine with it. So why did she have to die too? He could feel something inside him breaking. He wasn't sure if he even cared what it was, but if he had to guess it was probably his heart. She was his son. The only reason he kept moving forward. And if she was gone? He looked up as some of the dragons drew nearer, magic appearing to being gathered by them and aimed towards him. He had to move now if he wanted to avoid it. But he didn't move an inch. There was no reason to. The one thing in his life that had saved him from the abyss he had been falling into was gone. Even if he killed the dragons, what then? Where would he go? What would he do? What reason left would there be to even live another day? None. He had nothing left. Once again, he was all alone. And it felt worse this time because he was falling back into that same emptiness he had once felt. Cradling her body against him, he closed his eyes. Whatever happened now, he didn't care. He could die. He wanted to die. It was so painful. If he had any final wish, he wished it would all end. All of this, the pain, the loss, and the dragons themselves. But he couldn't do it. He tried once and it only broke him more. I guess I'll be joining you soon, Sonia, he muttered softly to her. I'm tired. So if you aren't here, I guess I can finally die. Still, he had one final wish if he could call it that. One full of cruelty that managed to speak up about the pain of loss he felt. He doubted it could even be granted, but he made it anyway to himself. Even if it was petty to think it, even if it was fueled by his pain, he didn't care. He just wished in that moment that all the dragons would die, just so Sonia's death would mean something. But that would be impossible, he muttered, his eyes darkening when he opened them one last time to glare up at the dragons above. Because to kill these beasts, you'd need to be a monster yourself. There was nothing he could do however, and, as the dragons began to fire, Rogue Cheney died. And from the ashes of his broken and damaged soul, another was born. Protector of the Fairies. The final roar of dragons. And there you have it, Rogue finished. The tale of Rogue, all the way to its end. Are you happy now? Hold up a second, Sting hurried to say, not wanting to take the chance of waiting any longer and allowing Rogue to pick up hostilities. Not when he still had too much to ask. What happened after that? You said you died, but you're right here. Incorrect, Igneel spoke up for the first time since the story began, the noise drawing Rogue's attention with a hint of wariness. He told us everything we needed to know. Another was born that day. Born from the broken shell of a man who kept losing everything. Am I wrong, Acknowledge? It seems one of you is remembering to call me by my name, Rogue replied calmly. You are correct. I did not exist until Rogue died. Not truly anyway. But with the loss of the last light in his life, he simply stopped. Stopped struggling, stopping fighting, stopped caring. He wanted to die. He wanted all the pain to end. And so he let it, surrendering everything to that abyss. But I didn't want to die, Rogue shot out quickly. I wanted to kill. To slaughter. To seek revenge for all Rogue had lost. Not to live yourself. I arose from the broken shell of a man, Rogue stated, as if the answer to Igneel's question was obvious. If there was any will to live present, I would have not been born at all. I was the anger and rage left behind, the emotions that still burned brightly even when in the darkest pits of despair. I was the feelings that didn't wish to go quietly, the ones Rogue buried away and tried to forget he ever once had. I am his dash. You're his shame. Sting saw how Rogue's fact turned into one of pure menace, and he had to wonder how Igneel could even say such words to him without flinching from fear. He wasn't even being directed that look and he was scared that Rogue would turn his way. Would you like to repeat that? You heard me, Igneel repeated slowly, as if speaking to a child. Though from his perspective, perhaps he was Sting considered. For a dragon of Igneel's size and strength, he had to be very old. You are his shame. You think I'm his shame? I slaughtered hundreds. Thousands. I am not shame. I am his rage. And that is why you're his shame, Igneel stated. Perhaps you didn't realize it yourself, but you told us how Rogue was broken down by the act of killing. Through the act of indulging in his rage and his lust for vengeance. Your rage is tremendous, your hatred legendary, but that is the part that was breaking Rogue. That was the shame he tried to forget. Every action you ever took, every death you caused, is all an action he would have hated himself for ever committing. And for that, I am not ashamed to say that I pity you, Igneel added somberly. When Rogue surrendered everything else, his shame no longer held you back. You emerged in the shell of a broken man and went wild because that is all you have. You exist as his rage. You exist to fulfill the vengeance he wanted, no longer bound by his own morals to keep you in check. In the end you are nothing more than the mad beast who ran wild across the world 400 years ago, chasing after a goal whose only purpose was to sustain your reason for existing. Pausing briefly, Igneel sent a curious look over towards the furious figure before him. The air was growing heavy from Acknowledge's magic, but all he did was increase his own pressure, the heat rising as flames began to spark to life across his scales. For all your talk of not being Rogue, however, you are driven purely by him. The rage you feel all stems from him. Your vengeance is for his sake. You are doing this for him, but then why not simply return to being him entirely? There is surely enough of him left for you to regain your old life? Or is it guilt that keeps him buried even to this day? Guilt for slaying his own father. His own father? Igneel, what are you talking about? Natsu asked curiously, unaffected by the heat and actual moving closer even when Acknowledge was forced to move a step back to get away from its full force. Isn't he still in there like you all were for us? Or has too much time passed? Time would make no difference, Igneel stated. 1 year or 400. What difference does it really make to us? No, the answer lies in the fact he stands before us as the very thing we tried to prevent. If Skyadrum was still inside him, he could never have turned into a dragon. He's right, Metallicana stated roughly. Our entire purpose being inside you lot was to prevent another Acknowledge. Though I'm still having to grasp the fact one of the few we raised to have a chance at defeating Acknowledge became Acknowledge. I made my protests about messing with time travel clear long ago, and now I see it has come to bit us in the arse. There would have always been an Acknowledge to start this path off, Grandini stated. One that would have encouraged us, or another to find a solution that would inevitably spawn the series of events that would lead to the Acknowledge we are familiar with. The original and the current need not be the same, only the fact that the same type of beast came to exist. We would have put up a hard fight to prevent it though, Vislaja pointed out, delivering a glare down towards Rogue. So? What happened to Skyadrum? When did he show up? Oh? Not going to ask why? Rogue asked with a smirk. You don't want to know how he begged before he died? Begged for who? For himself? Or for you? Rogue's smirk dropped. What does it matter? Besides, I encountered him little over 3 months after my birth. He finally emerged in the cover of night, right after I had finished killing 2 more dragons that had tried to claim their own vengeance. Hardly put up much of a fight. Skyadrum, I mean. He just tried to spout out nonsense before I finally had enough and put him out of his misery. There. Right there. Rogue frowned, a brief bit of confusion appearing across his face. Huh. You said it yourself, Vislager replied. You put Skyadrum out of his misery. Those words weren't chosen carefully, you spoke them without thinking. That was the action you took that day. And there is a very big difference between killing someone out of vengeance and putting them out of their misery, Igneel stated. One is driven by an ugly and selfish desire. The other, kindness. Cruel kindness, but kindness nonetheless. For once Rogue had nothing to say, confused by his own words. I think I know what happened that day, Igneel continued, pressing on while Rogue was shaken. The reason we had to travel forward in time was because the age we were in wasn't rich enough in magic to allow us to do the work we needed to do. The antibodies in your blood must have been nearing completion, but your trip into the past changed everything, stopping the process before it could be finished. From there your use of Dragon Slayer of magic would have begun to have to cause a change. Igneel gestured slightly towards Laxus. Not nearly as noticeable as with him, mind you. I assume you would have never noticed yourself to begin with. Your resistance would have been too high, and you stopped for a long period too. But once you, as in Acknowledge, was born, things changed. Bathing in a dragon's blood was a surefire way to begin to speed up the process, but Rogue didn't kill enough. Not as many as you must have done once you awoke. A dragon's blood has magical properties to it. It holds an essence of who we are, and if you began to bath in it from your battles again and again without rest, well, even if nothing changed on the outside you must surely have noticed an increase in power. Igneel paused briefly before sighing. And Skyadrum would have noticed too. He would have seen it happen and realized that he was powerless to stop it. I'd potentially even guess that he might have realized that the dragon cells your body was mutating into were stronger than anything ever seen, those that survived having bypassed your original high resistance and raising you far above a typical dragon's power to stop. And realizing what you were going to become, he must have felt it his duty to stop you. Except I killed him, Rogue snarled out. He could do nothing to stop me. Now when did I ever say he planned to fight you to do that? Igneel asked sadly. You were his son. The child he loved, and probably still did even after realizing you were the monster who slaughtered our race. And a father cannot easily raise a weapon to strike down their child. So he didn't. I reckon when he appeared he made little effort to fight you, speaking to you the entire time. Shut your mouth before I tear out your throat. This is your last warning. I see I have touched a nerve, Igneel stated. But that alone speaks wonders. I asked you who he begged for. Himself or you? I can see now who it was for. As you slaughtered him, your own father, he was probably crying out begging you to stop. Did he ever say he wanted you to stop killing him? Or merely to stop the path you were on? Do you remember his words? Do you remember his sorrow? You know nothing. Growled Rogue, clutching his head with one hand as if a pain was erupting inside. I killed him. Like all the rest. And he had the nerve to dare beg me to stop? To spare them. He wasn't sparing them, Sting spoke softly, Rogue's head snapping towards him. He wanted to spare you. To spare me. Sting nodded. And then, against his and everyone else's better judgment, began to move forward, closing the gap ever so slightly to get closer to the man who had been his best friend and brother. What he wanted might have had the same result, but I doubt he cared about whether the dragons would be saved or not. He would have only cared that his son was going down a dark path, filled with nothing but violence and bloodshed, and wanted to save you from it. If he didn't even put up a fight, it should tell you enough to know which he wanted. Be quiet. All of you be quiet. Don't you realize what he wanted from you? Sting asked, daring to get a bit closer still. He wanted peace for you. To save you from a life where your own purpose was to kill dragons. To allow you a chance for happiness once again, even if it meant his own life would be lost. You know that, don't you? I said be quiet. Don't you realize it? He wanted you to be his son again. He wanted you to be Rogue. And I didn't want to be. Rogue roared out, making the others flinch back in fear at the fury in his voice. Only Sting managed to remain where he was, hearing what the others had missed behind that fury. The pain behind those words, which became only more obvious as he drew nearer and Rogue's voice softened. I didn't want to be Rogue, Rogue muttered softly. Being Rogue, that life had become hell. So why would I ever want to go back to being him? What purpose could I have gained by throwing away the one scrap I had left? Rogue had nothing. I, at the very least, had something. Even if it was only a remnant. Even if it came from another. It was still mine. It was more than he had left. That's not true, Sting stated, finally coming to a stop only a meter away before extending out a hand towards Rogue. You still have me, don't you? Rogue frowned as their gazes met, confusion obvious in his old friend's eyes. Seeing him like this, he could finally get a glimpse of just how weary of this all his friend was. How much it must have burdened him for all these years. 400 years have passed, Sting stated. You had to take the long way round, but you're back now. You made it all the way home, even if that home is a bit broken right now. But you still managed to come all the way back when you once thought it was impossible. I did, didn't I? He could see it. The part of his friend still in there, under all that hatred and pain. The part of him that could hear his voice. Come home, Rogue. You don't have to keep fighting anymore. A familiar smile graced Rogue's features for a moment, marred by bitterness. You would really offer such a chance to a monster such as myself? How much blood do you think is on these hands of mine? How many innocents? How many guilty? I have slaughtered my way across all of Fiore and beyond, never caring about the destruction I left in my wake. Even if I went with you, I would never be forgiven. To survive, I would fight. We could find a way, he replied, but even he could tell he sounded desperate. But even so, he couldn't give up on this chance. Not when his friend was right there, right in front of him, and he had the power to do something about it. There are others. Hades has done terrible things, but he'll likely be pardoned after the war for his assistance in stopping greater evils. The same could happen for you. He didn't think Rogue's smile could get bitter until it did. You mean greater evils like myself? How many other monsters are there that can match myself? What assistance could I even grant to swallow up my own deeds? We don't know until we try, Sting stated determinedly. There's still the bosses of the enemies left, even if their armies have broken. And Alvarez is still dangerous. Help us. Prove to everyone you can still be Rogue. No matter what, I'll stand by you. You know I will. I know, Rogue muttered softly. His friend took a step towards him in the air and he didn't dare move away, allowing Rogue to close the gap himself on his own terms. I could go back to Sabretooth and see the others. My old friends. Their faces and names are lost, but I remember the feeling. You could see them all again, Sting stated, putting on a smile that was honestly easier than he thought it would be. But it might have been because he could see it even clearer now. There wasn't any Acknowledger in front of him. Only Rogue. A more broken Rogue, but still Rogue. Do you trust me? Rogue paused briefly, looking at the hand hesitantly as if struggling with himself. I do, he finally muttered, his hand slowly reaching out before taking his own. Any attempts to keep the smile up were easy at this point for Sting. The joy he felt did it all for him. Finally, after all that searching, he had his best friend back. He had Rogue back. But it's too late to turn back now. And with those words he felt like his heart shattered in two. The grip on his hand tightened, becoming a vice grip against him as all the hesitation and confusion and pain bled away from Rogue's face and returned to the same cold and cruel one he had come to associate with Acknowledger. I am Acknowledger, Acknowledger stated, the last aspects he had seen of his friend falling deep into that void within once more. And I will finish what I started all those years ago. Starting with you. He didn't have time to react. He hadn't built up any magic in preparation nor even been prepared to move. With all the time he tried to break away, but Acknowledger's grip merely tightened further, the bones in his hand cracking and breaking under the strain. By the time he even had put together a plan to escape, Acknowledger was already striking, magic wrapped around the dragon's claws as they swiped them out at his head. Only he wasn't in the same place as he was before when he next blinked. He was a few feet away, and it took him longer than it should have at this point to realize why. After this fight he'd have to treat Wendy to whatever she wanted. He'd lost track of how many times she had saved his life at this point. Looking at Acknowledger, he wanted to keep reaching out for his friend who he had seen still in there. To draw him back out. But it was too late for that now. He had been given his chance by the others. A chance they hadn't needed to give him, but one they had done so anyway. And he failed. Whatever part of Rogue was left, it wasn't enough to drown out all that was Acknowledger. Which meant they had to return to the only option they had begun with. To kill Acknowledger. Protector of the Fairies. Each moment felt like his blood was boiling to Acknowledger. Every second was another of the last great battle he would ever have, and he was lapping it all up hungrily. Towers of ice rose up to trap him, restraining his movements. Was that iron he noticed in it too, shielded by the ice as it rose, hoping he would have ignored the ice as a harmless bit of interference? Fools. He was more aware now than he had ever been. Igneel came at him from above, releasing flames in a roar so hot he could feel some of his scales melting from the inferno just from being near it. The ice and metal that he had dodged was quickly incinerated, and he might have been hurt if he had stayed there to face the hit. But he wasn't foolish enough to take on a hit from one of the last great dragons without being able to fight back himself. And thanks to that girl flying around somewhere, he was still limited in what kind of magic he could unleash without it being sent right back on him. It wasn't like he didn't have tricks up his sleeves though. How long had he fought without that disguise he had crafted? How long had it been since he took it down? He couldn't remember. At some point he had grown so accustomed to wearing it. To always be seen as the invincible and all-powerful acknowledger. How foolish. In the end, he had always been at his strongest when wounded. He had always pulled through every challenge by being brought to the brink of death and overcoming it time and time again. Every battle had been a fight for survival, and now he was experiencing that again. If it was a battle for survival, he knew how to win. It was the same kind of battle he had faced every single time he fought 400 years ago. The dragons would have never taken him alive, and so not once did they ever avoid the chance to go for the kill. Either they would die, or he would. It was an easy choice to make. The fact he enjoyed killing them had helped. Like those times of old, he had to determine his actions. Which enemy was the greatest threat? Who should he leave for last? Who could he afford to leave for last? And which were the ones that would block him every step of the way? END was dangerous. But until he destroyed the book, END would keep returning. He couldn't afford to waste power right now when surrounded by so many foes. So long as he could keep END away and deal with him when necessary, he could go after the book once the enemies started dwindling. The abomination of a dragon and a human. He was more pressing. His speed was greater than he had anticipated, and even now he could tell that the thing was getting faster, learning how to use his abilities more and more. In all other areas he still held the upper hand, but he could not dismiss the power that thing had gained. Some of the others were nuisances. The Iron Dragon Slayer, the Shinigami, even a few of the dragons weren't nearly as dangerous in his eyes as some of their children. The Ukin, however, was a different matter. It was like alarm bells would going off in his head every time the Dragon Slayer's power rose, and he didn't like what that was telling him. His instincts rarely betrayed him in battle. Then there was Sting. With magic like his own, it was doing a lot more damage to him than he had ever let on. It hurt, and without his old illusion it would become apparent soon. But Sting's actions were still slow compared to some of the others. Was reluctance staying his hand? Perhaps. And of course there was also the major dragon to be weary of. Igneel was not a threat to dismiss lightly. Even with everyone else he had considered so far, Igneel still ranked as the most dangerous purely because of the strength he wielded and the intensity of his flames. Under normal circumstances, he would be the one he would have to take down most urgently. But if there was any single target worth focusing on, over any other, it was her. That girl, hiding somewhere. He could make all the moves he wanted, fire off the strongest of spells capable of destroying armies, and she would counter it. She'd moved allies out of harm's way, healed wounds that should have been fatal by all accounts, and had restored the magic of those around him countless times over. The very magic in the air shifted when she used that spell of hers. But the fact she could redirect any attack, even the full power of Etherian itself, made her more dangerous than anyone else. The worst part was that she was content to remain in hiding. That mere action was keeping him in check since he would have no warning when she teleports, but if he could lock her in place for a moment. How long would that take though? Would she escape again like before? If he didn't kill her in a single shot, then she was sure to recover like before and teleport away. He needed to ensure she died, and to do that he'd have to surprise her in some way. And he knew just how. Now first he just had to draw her out. With a roar of challenge he leapt towards the dragon-human hybrid as it made another dash at him, watching its movements carefully and trying to work out at what point he had to act. At the last moment he saw a flash from the right, a fist being swung as it returned to physical form, and it slammed straight into him and continued right through as his chest separated before the attack. Darkness swirled around the hole in his chest, striking out at the lightning as a silence clash of magic occurred between the two. Given time he was sure his own energy would win out, and it seemed the thing knew that too, his arm being drawn back as he turned completely to lightning and tried to retreat. He didn't let the thing get away, his body moving forward that brief distance as shadows before a hand of shadows managed to reach out, grab the thing by its hand. By the time the dragon hybrid realized he had him, he had spun on his heel in the air and thrown the hybrid straight down towards the ground, trusting in the loud impact noise he heard to assure him of his success. No sooner had he done so did he have to fend off a two-pronged attack. From either side light was continuously fired down upon him, each made intentionally bright so that they would blind him and seal away his vision. He quickly switched to his hearing and sense of smell instead, knowing that this was only a diversion so another could get close. So of course it'll be the brutes in this case, he muttered, raising a hand in either direction towards the large presences he could feel approaching. The two beings of iron, preparing to crush me between themselves. But before they could reach him however, he suddenly lowered his hands and darted upwards, his wings pushing him far above as a wave of flames devoured the space he had been standing. That's what you wanted me to believe, right? I actually hoped you wouldn't, came God Serena's voice from behind him. His arm shot out in time as a downward swipe from the man's leg collided with him, unleashing the magic wrapped around it and sending him rushing down towards the fiery inferno. His wings halted his descent before it could work, but with his vision returning he could already see the signs of magic being gathered and shaped around the Ukin. The man intended to push him down into the flames and try and keep him there. At a time like this, there was one option always available normally. He raised his own hand in turn, magic of his own gathering in threads of darkness and light that interwove together and gathered around his hand, ready to be unleashed. The difference between their two attacks became apparent the moment they both fired. The Ukin's was multiple focused blasts, trying to close off his avenues to escape through. Each would have probably packed a punch, but his single sweeping attack was stronger than all of them. It was also an attack he was sure was significantly dangerous to that Ukin. And then she appeared. In the time it took to blink, the same blue-haired girl that was causing him so much trouble had managed to reappear in between the two attacks, positioned in such a way that none of her own allies' attacks would collide with her. His would, at least under normal circumstances. These weren't that, so it was no surprise when her hand moved and caused his entire attack to be turned right back at him in the blink of an eye. Good. That was exactly what he had been waiting for. He knew what they were thinking in a time like this. They had him where they wanted him. They had forced him to use his magic once again, and now he would take the full brunt of it. He wouldn't get out unscathed from an attack like that. And that would never be enough to put him down. The girl's technique was truly dangerous, but she should have waited. Her trump card was to redirect the other's trump card, but this was not even close to his strongest spell. So as it shot back at him, he charged into his own attack without fear, his right arm brought up in defense and taking the brunt of the strike while he continued to push his way through. As he broke through the last remains of his spell, he unleashed another right before her eyes. No matter how fast she was, she wouldn't redirect this one. He had been able to tell that she hadn't expected it in the slightest, and the wave of magic crashed against her before she even had a chance to teleport away. Before he could press further, the sensation of a dozen dragons bearing down on him forced him to back away, narrowly avoiding the magic-coated fist of the Ukin. So this is what you were holding back, he muttered, noticing the odd shape the magic took around the man's fist. It was like 8 miniature dragons, each wrapping around his limb and enhancing his power tremendously. No wonder your scent was so confusing. There are too many echoes left in it. The Ukin narrowed his eyes at him, but he paid the man little heed when he noticed his own magic clearing. He couldn't help but growl in annoyance at the sight of her still breathing. Her skin was burnt from the exposure to the raw power he had used, but it was returning to its normal color with every moment that passed. She looked weaker though. Much weaker than before. Ah. The strain was getting to her. A power like hers always had a limit, and now it seemed she was about to reach it. Her body would hardly be able to recover if it lacked the ability to take in any more magical power for her spell to use. Seeing her like this removed any urgency to eliminate her. She was on her last legs without him doing anything else. All he had to do was wait and she'd burn herself out, and once she did the others would fall one by one. It was no wonder they were getting desperate. They were almost out of chances. All of you. Can you hear me? He frowned as Ziref's voice filled the air, his eyes momentarily glancing away towards the source. A massive gate was present in his line of sight, Ziref's voice coming from somewhere close to it, and he had a nagging feeling he should remember that gate. Oh. That was the Dark Mage's Zanpakutu. The Black Ring of Life and Death, Solomon. Is this what you plan to fall back on, Ziref? He called out mockingly. Once again, your only answer is to throw more demons at a problem. You haven't changed at all. When Acknowledge attacks me, throw everything you have at him. Hold nothing back. Did Ziref think that would work? The man was screaming his plan out as loud as he could. He could hear it too. The man was a fool if he thought this would work. All he had to do to foil it was ignore it. Raising a hand towards the Ukin, he let magic gather and watched as the Ukin prepared a form of defense, ready to move if the situation called for it. You won't be ignoring this Acknowledge. You'll walk into this trap by your own free will. Presences shot up towards him in the thousands. They were all so pathetic he wondered what Ziref was even playing at. Keeping his attack charging, he gathered enough magic for his purpose in his other hand and swung out without caring, simply allowing a blanket of pure magic to smash into the waves of demons sent flying at him. He wasn't sure if it was by chance or by pure blind luck, but he could still sense one of those demons after his magic destroyed the rest. In a moment it would be right on top of him, but it was still as weak as all the others. To deal with it, he merely turned his eyes towards the danger and grabbed the first thing he saw moving, his hands crushing the demon's next in a heartbeat. What even was this demon anyway? It hardly had any strength, and it didn't seem like a suicide bomber of some kind. It had too much detail though to be a nameless entity Ziref made on a whim. Rather it was shaped like a cat. Or a frog. Or both. In a familiar form. He knew that form. The connection wasn't his, but he could feel some time inside him stirring, his anger rising in response. He still remembered Ziref's words. This was a trap. Ziref was doing this to draw him in. But after seeing that demon, he didn't care. For a brief moment it wasn't Acknowledge standing there, recognizing something familiar. It was Rogue, seeing the form of someone very precious to him. Ziref. Without a single bit of hesitation he flung himself down towards the massive gate, magic twisted and intertwining in his hands before he smashed it all straight into the gate with a giant roar. The giant structure shattered under the weight of the magic, and hiding behind it did nothing to help Ziref when the rest of the storm of magic slammed down upon him, not even settling to simply destroy the ground too, but to burrow down deep into the earth. By the time Acknowledge managed to regain control of himself, he realized too late he had played right into Ziref's hands. All or nothing. Roared Metallicana, the dragon, having gotten way too close for comfort in that brief moment he had lost himself. He spun round just in time to grab the dragon by the front of his head, but he hadn't enough time to put his full strength behind it. Metallicana meanwhile must have rushed him at full speed. The difference between the two forces was easily apparent when he was flung, smashing into the newly formed cliff face of the hole he had made previously. His eyes managed to see through the clearing smoke as the iron dragon pulled back, revealing a second in its shadow as the giant armored form of Gajeel slammed down against him. What he expected was to feel a heavy weight slam into him. What happened though was enough to surprise him, the iron that slammed into him breaking the moment it made contact and causing the rest of the armor to slam into the wall around him. He realized then what this attempt was. Not an attack but a cage. It would hardly hold him, but it didn't need to. The dragon slayer responsible had already fled, it appeared, which meant the true attack was incoming. With a slash of his claws, the iron before him shattered, revealing Metallicana once more as the dragon rushed down at him, one arm held out to the side as its shape morphed with iron. What was once an arm became a long sword, swinging down on him with what he was sure would be all the strength the dragon could muster. If the dragon really felt like this was enough, he'd be surely mistaken. He could easily avoiding it. Pushing against the earth wall, he leapt forward in order to escape the remains of his iron cage once for a blur to slam into him at the last second from behind. The sudden surprise threw him off as Metallicana swung, but he recovered just in time, one hand managing to press down against the iron blade's flat surface and push his body over the oversized blade. As his eyes got a glimpse back though, he had a brief moment to take in the flash of lightning before a giant slug of metal was accelerated from the smirking dragon slayer, hitting his chest with enough force that he actually felt some of his scales shatter as he was flung up into the air. That dragon slayer still had something up his sleeve? He'd assumed the dragon slayer's strongest technique had been that dragon armor. That smaller armored version, sparking with lightning, was something new to him though, as was the attack that had struck him. It had moved far faster than any attack the dragon slayer had thrown before, but if he could use it repeatedly then he would have done so already. That was likely his last strike. Such a waste to use it now. That thought however ground to a halt as the heat from above became noticeable. He was still trying to control his flight, the power of that previous attack having flung him far further than he had expected, and this of all things was not something he wanted to deal with right now. Standing there high up in the air, flames from his feet holding him up, was that accursed END. He could have avoided him normally, but he still hadn't recovered. And it didn't look like END was going to let him have the time to do so either. His hands held at his sides and upwards, END was sending a stream of fire upwards, collecting it all in one massively contained barrier of wind. The technique itself seemed more in line with the ones he had seen this Dragon Slayer use before, but with the curse power of END running through him it changed everything about this attack. Heavenly flames. Natsu roared down as the last of the flames he needed gathered, a giant ball many times his size held above his head. That burned to the end. His wings beat quickly as he tried to hasten his recovery, but END was already swinging his hands down, the giant inferno that was held within the winds being flung down at him. From previous experience with these flames he knew just how deadly an attack like that was. If he was hit by it, he couldn't shrug it off. In the last moment he had left, his wings finally brought him under control. The first thing he did was immediately dash away, the flames gaining faster than he would have liked as the winds holding them back broke and let the flames chase after him uncontrollably, being fanned to greater heights by the same winds that had once held them captive. Any other attack he might have been able to overpower with raw magic, but this? It would eat away at every bit of strength he threw at it. His chance to escape finally occurred as he neared the ground, the uneven earth from the long battle having reshaped the landscape into a mess. It resulted in many out-of-place juts of earth all over the place, providing cover for his enemies most of the time, but for once he'd be thankful for it. It slowed the flames down in areas as it hit. Not by much, not even for more than a second before the earth was broken down and incinerated, but for someone with his speed it was fast enough to find the openings he needed to escape. Even with all of that, he couldn't escape unscathed. What had once been a ball of fire had ended up more equivalent to a tsunami of flames, blanketing the landscape and devouring everything in sight. It had lost power, but it didn't stop it from burning the scales off his back as he flung his way through the last bit of flames, making his way to freedom. All it would take would be some hasty work to pat them out and he'd be fine. Only he never got the chance. The second he broke free, Grandini was waiting for him, her melodies being heard across the sky as she sang her spells. The very air around him became his enemy as the winds picked up, flinging him up uncontrollably and fanning the flames higher. He could feel them burning away at his wings, a cry of pain escaping his throat before he crushed the rest of his body's protests. This wind wouldn't hold him for long. But it would hold him for long enough if he kept this up. He had to take extreme methods. Abandoning his human form, he called forth the familiar power at his core and let his body shift. For a moment the flames burned brighter, feeding off the excess magical power he was releasing, before they were pushed out across different areas on his body, harmful but less severe as his body returned to his full dragon state. The impact also caused the pull on the winds to weaken, their strength no longer able to throw his full weight up. They tried, and he could feel the strength increasing as the dragon tried to add more magic to her spell, but it was too late. With a loud roar he shattered the magic binding him, continuing it, and using the shockwave it produced to send the scales he quickly shred to scatter along with the flames that still clung to them. His body immediately began to shift back to his human state, desiring the extra strength he gained from his power's compression. As the change was beginning to occur though, he saw the lightning streak through the sky and slam into him, sending him flying back and disrupting his concentration. As his eyes met the abomination zone, he saw the same spears as before, all gathering and spinning behind the Dragon Slayer's back. This wasn't enough last time, Laxus called out, golden light shining in the palm of his hand as he raised it up. Each speed quickly rose, lining up around one another as the golden light spread and wrapped around them, encasing them all in one large container of the same shape. Then what happens if I focus them all down? I'd say you're a much easier target to hit like that. He refocused on changing, even as the abomination went to throw his spear. He still had time to dodge, and his change would throw the Dragon Slayer off. Dragon Slayer's secret fairy art. Laxus roared, the massive weapon suddenly accelerating as it left his hands as the winds roared with him. Storm-shattering Gungnir. He could have dodged it normally. But the winds made the weapon too fast. What should have taken at least another few seconds to close that large gap between them shortened to a third. His form was already shifting, but the spear still found its mark, the barrier holding all its power in place, shattering on contact and allowing every bit of lightning stored within to surge straight into his body. He roared, far louder than any time before, as his body screamed out in pain. Even as he managed to take his human form once again, it was not without injury. Blood poured out from his right side, his entire arm torn away at the shoulder and leaving nothing more than a bloody mess. Lightning still clung against the wound, inflicting bits of pain as he tried to see past all of it. He didn't even get time when the entire world appeared to light up, as if dawn was happening right in front of his eyes in repeat. He knew whose work this was. Vislage's, the dim dragon of light. But with the dragon's diminishing power, this wouldn't last forever. This was just a temporary measure, and once that was undoubtedly blinding his own allies. If they wanted to aim, they'd have a hard time to. They didn't need to aim. And one in particular was already on his mind. The individual that merely needed to touch something to have it freeze over, and could engulf an area in ice in a heartbeat. His magic flared to life as he recognized the danger, his feet carrying him forward before causing him to leap upwards in an attempt to get away from the ground. Down there he'd be a sitting duck. The light blinding him finally came to a halt as he let himself sail through the air. His eyes immediately searched for targets, looking for the one he knew was coming. 3. He heard him before he saw him, seeing the form of the Dragon Slayer as he lunged towards him from below. The Dragon Slayer swung his sword, but in a quick move he swung his claws first against the blade, hitting it with enough force to tear it out of the Dragon Slayer's hand and cause it to go spinning up through the air. His other hand quickly reached up, his claws about to grasp the Dragon Slayer's throat until 4. That single word was uttered, and then he froze. At the edge of his vision he could see the ice stretching out far further, and he already knew that if he was able to look around, then he'd see that the ice would have consumed everything in the other direction. The ice was strong. Much stronger than usual. But it still couldn't hold him. It cracked, broke, and finally shattered as he tore his way free of it. But the Dragon Slayer was already gone, having retreated the moment his task was done. He knew it meant another attack was coming, another of those all-or-nothing strikes these pests had flung at him. For a brief moment he thought it was END coming in for another round. But as he turned around he realized it couldn't be. The lingering flames that had been left over from before had all been frozen over by the ice, having been unable to burn it away quickly enough. These flames, though he doubted could ever be frozen over. Even the ice, spreading out into the horizon, would soon become nothing more than a cloud of steam soon. The flames were simply that hot. An attack of the last great dragons, he muttered, seeing the form of the mighty Igneel as he rose his head back. So this is your final attack too. Indeed. This will lead to your end, acknowledge. The final roar of the King of Flames. So in the spirit of my child. Dragon's final art, roar of the Flame King. Calling the fire that was unleashed as an inferno wouldn't be doing it justice. The moment Igneel released those flames, they had become all he could see, a massive storm of all the dragon's magic in their most dangerous state. But they weren't E.N.Ds flames. Those flames had made him run because that'd been his only option. These, however, were still flames of normal magic, even if the user was an individual as dangerous as Igneel. It meant his own magic could act. A weak attack wouldn't cut it. The worry of the girl redirecting his attack was thrown away from the lack of other options, and he summoned up all the magic he could gather, devouring more from the air around him to fuel his own breath attack. He was sure with the time he had it wouldn't be as spectacular, but it was enough. With a challenging roar of his own, he unleashed his magic and let the two roars clash for dominance. His was the smaller of the two, there was no doubt. But he had known he didn't have enough time to counter this attack. It had the power though, and the flames that struck it quickly found they couldn't force their way past. Instead, the mighty roar of flames was parted around him. For what it was worth to Igneel, this wasn't a comfortable feeling. Any other individual might have been burnt alive inside this newly formed cage. His remaining scales helped protect him, but he hadn't had a chance to replace the other damaged ones under so many continuous assaults. He'd definitely be feeling this attack tomorrow, but at least he'd have it tomorrow. The hairs on the back of his head caused him to almost freeze up. He'd sensed that suddenly appearance of magical power behind him. But he hadn't thrown an attack that way. What was that girl? Ignil's flames. Damn you! He screamed at the flames as the ones that had passed suddenly shifted direction, accelerating towards his exposed back. He couldn't turn his head away, not while the full force of Ignil's attack was still coming, so in his haste he lashed out backwards with a massive wave of magic. It shielded him somewhat, but he still felt the scales and flesh on his left leg get burnt away as some of the flames broke their way through. Letting himself collapse on that one knee, he threw his head upwards and let his breath attack accelerate him down as the rest of the flames clashed against one another. He got a glimpse of the attacks beginning to draw to an end as his own magic faded, but before he could use his wings to recover himself he saw a streak of light shot down at him. He made to try and recover, but Sting was faster currently, reforming right before him and slamming his fist down against him with all the magical power he had been able to muster. Compared to the other attacks it was rather simple, he thought. At least until it had him sailing down towards the ground at breakneck speeds, his wings helpless to slow his fall as the massive blast of magic that had been released kept him from slowing down. He hit the ground hard, but he didn't have time to rest when he saw a flash of metal in the air, pushing himself away just as the spinning Zanpakuta from before dug tip first into the ground where he had been standing. Was even his luck conspiring against him today? He hardly had time to pay attention to the sword, however, as he felt the pain from the previous attack. It hurt massively. Against that attack his scales had done nothing. Even as he slammed into the ground it wasn't over either, a massive orb of light and darkness being flung down at him from the same source as the attack. He hadn't been able to stop the first attack, but this one he could. His lone hand rose and met the energy, his own magic rising in response and forcing the attack to shatter. He wasn't far enough away to avoid some of the backlash as a result, but it was far better than taking the attack head on. It wasn't the end though. There was a pattern here. One after the other, an attack had been thrown at him from every member of this battle. And that left only one. He felt the magic all around them, in almost every direction, get sucked towards one point. Had Sting's attack been a distraction? No, it had been the real thing. That was why he had been forced to focus on it. These pests were hiding in the shadows of each other's attacks, using opponents he was forced to create in order to escape, and even now he had another left open. He was turning, but like before he knew he wouldn't be able to stop the attack in time. This is over. He saw God Serena roar, closing the gap and unleashing a massive blast of energy straight against him. For a moment it almost made him freeze up as the pain registered. And then he swung out, intended to destroy the menace before him. The Ukin leapt back away from him and he leapt after to pursue, his vision still shaky, only to notice the smirk on the Ukin's face. That attack wasn't the trap. This one was. A bit of uneven ground sticking up. That was all God Serena needed to propel himself back forward, all the energy he had stored being brought forth in one moment. The sword he had dismissed before was pulled from the ground by the Ukin as he passed, looking to weight the Ukin down briefly before it seemed to settle reluctantly into his hands. That was when he saw them. The forms of 8 dragons, wrapping around the blade one by one until it hardly looked like a blade at all. It was more like a mass of dragons trying to fuse into one by intertwining themselves. He tried to move, but his body was sluggish. His wings were finding it hard to move and his muscles were screaming at him in pain along with everything else. If this attack had come first, he was sure he could have dodged it. It was only a thrust. But he couldn't. Not when the Ukin had waited for this chance. With a scream of defiance, the Ukin thrust the sword forward and he did all he could to try and move his body. It didn't stop the blade from piecing his chest, however, nor the energy of the either dragons wrapped around it from being unleashed and tearing a massive hole around the blade as magic exploded out uncontrollably in all directions. His scales had taken plenty of beatings over the years. They had been battered, bruised, torn, sliced, shattered, and more recently incinerated. But as far as he could remember, it had been a very long time since someone had been able to make so many of them shatter at once through sheer raw power alone. Blood poured from the massive open wound in his chest, the sword now merely by its wielder held in the center of it all, and it would have taken a miracle for anyone to ever recover from such a wound. And yet for all your efforts, he growled out, his heart still beating safely in what remained in the untouched areas of his chest, It still isn't enough. God Serena tried to retreat but he didn't let him, grabbing the blade with his remaining hand and ignoring the sensation of the metal digging into his flesh. It weighed a ton in his grasp but he didn't let go or let it weigh him down. The Ukin quickly abandoned the blade but he caught up to him in an instant. The Ukin may have used up all the strength he could summon. But him? His body would fall before his magic ran dry. One hand dug straight into the Ukin's chest. He missed the heart but he found something equally valuable, tearing the lacrima out from the Ukin's body and shattering it as his claws tightened around the fragile thing. If I remember correctly, he growled out, your power jumped when you went from using 4 forms of magic to 8. But you skipped 5 through 7. It's because you wanted to avoid upsetting your magic's delicate balance in that hybrid state, wasn't it? If I'm wrong, just go ahead and try. We'll see whose body breaks down first. Whatever retort the Ukin had was quickly ignored as he flung the Dragon Slayer upwards, Vyslaja flying at him and being forced to halt and try and grab the Dragon Slayer. Quickly turning he found both Sting and the Abomination trying to hit him in his blind spot, quite desperately too. But they were so slow. They truly had put their all into their strikes, and now they had barely any magic to use left. He didn't hesitate to use his own superior speed, even as his leg screamed at him to stop overexerting himself. He was Acknowledger, the dragon that remained undefeated. And that would stay the same even today. With one swift move he slashed out, unleashing a wave of magic that sent them flying back. He quickly closed the gap he made and delivered a single punch to each of them in turn, enjoying the feeling as his magic shattered the bones in his fist's path and left the Dragon Slayers in agony on the ground. Not even the Abomination's new body was strong enough to stop his blows in its current state. END tried to take advantage of that but this time he threw his whole strength forward, destroying the body like so many times before. Even END appeared to be reaching his limits too. His magical power was recovering tremendously fast but his recovery? It was so much slower than ever before. It appeared the one responsible for that was the weak link now. He took to the skies once more, his wings protesting but still reluctantly obeying as he chased down some of the remaining Dragon Slayers. Iron flew at him as the Dragon Slayer rode on the back of his father but it was nothing more than a minor nuisance now, lacking the strength it once had. The iron was simply too brittle. Bringing his head back, he gathered magic and roared, unleashing it all in a vortex of magic intent of crushing the two of them. Ice appeared in the air as a barrier as the other Dragon Slayer stepped in but it shattered under the weight of his magic. He had the 3 of them now. And then the girl appeared, popping in. His heart almost stopped as her hand shifted in the air, as if to send his attack right back at him. It wasn't to be. Protector of the Fairies. I'm sorry, Wendy. Those were the only words Wendy heard before the power before her fingertips vanished. She had a brief moment to look on in horror before the rest of her vision vanished and she began to scream. She knew it wasn't from the attack, that had to be hitting the others now. No. The reason for her screams was the pain that was engulfing her body as she fell from the sky, unable to do anything to stop her fall. Her magic barely responded to her, and she couldn't see the world properly either. Her eyes hurt the most. She'd recognized the pain for a while now but it appeared Nirvana had been the only thing keeping her seeing. She had known how dangerous absorbing magic like she had been was, she had seen it firsthand when she had first met Ichigo, but she had never experienced the sensation herself. And she had certainly never pushed it as hard as she had. Nabara's words continued to echo through her mind, and she thought she could hear him apologizing too. It explained why Nirvana had suddenly failed on her. He had told her he would cut her off the moment before she would die. She had wanted to keep going but her body had reached its limit first. She couldn't feel any magic even entering her currently and trying to breathe the air in did nothing to help. It only felt like poison as her body tried to process something it couldn't process at its broken state. She felt something catch her in the air briefly, her momentum ceasing, but her screams continued along with the pain. Vaguely though she thought she could hear soft humming through the wool in her mind, blocking her from sensing anything else around her. She recognized that tune. From long ago. Grandini had sung it to her. Whenever she had been hurt or scared or lonely, she had sung this song to her. It was a song to make her pain go away, and while it wasn't working this time it was still a lifeline to her. Something to cling onto. Grandini. Is that you? I'm here, Wendy. Stay still. You're there, right? She asked, trying to work out where to look for Grandini's face. She wanted to see her right now. This pain hurt so much, and if she could even see a familiar face. She forced her eyes to open, to focus, and her brain screamed at her in protest. She tried to endure it anyway, forcing herself to find reassurance in the face of her mother. Wendy, listen to me. You'll be alright. Just rest for a while, okay? I'll protect you. What's happening? Is one of the others dash? This is the end for all of you. It's alright, sweetie. Please keep your voice down a moment, so arg. Grandini. Suddenly she felt like she was falling again. Something clung to her and she felt herself pulled against a feathery chest. She tried to ask Grandini for answers only to feel them both suddenly come to a halt. A moment later and she felt herself being placed against the ground, still held closely to her mother as if being shielded. Listen to me, Wendy. I love you. I always will. Please remember that. Grandini? What's happening? Grandini. I always will, Wendy. My precious child. Perish. Grandini. She felt the winds turn into a storm around them, and then settle as if something had forced them away. Something fell on her too. Tears? Her eyes hastily managed to focus, seeing a blur of something before her. She briefly smiled, taking in the sight of Grandini. That sight slowly turned to horror as another drop fell on her and she realized it was blood, and that her whole top half of her mother had been ripped away. Her body still hurt, but the pain came from something far worse this time. She didn't even bother stopping herself from screaming. Protector of the fairies. Breathing heavily, Acknowledge desperately drew in breaths of air before taking in the sight before him. He had done it. They were all down for the count. Igneel had already been barely able to move after his last attack, and now the dragon was trying to stand as a barrier between him and the other dragon slayers. The other dragons joined him, all but Grandini. That dragon was already dead further behind the lot, though the girl wasn't. He could hear her screams from here as she lay under the form of her dead mother. As for the other dragon slayers, they were struggling to stand. Each was in various conditions, but they looked like they still wanted to fight. Their magical power, however, told the truth. Even if they wanted to keep going, they were spent. END might be able to, but without the others he would be easy to deal with alone. The Ukin was the only other trouble, but without his 8th Lacrima, he would be greatly weakened even if he did restore his magical power. Letting light and darkness intertwine around his fingers, he held up his hand and allowed the magic to form a thin rod of energy. The dragons attempted to say something, turning back to their charges and giving what he assumed were words of farewell. He could even hear some of them. "Don't kick the bucket too early, brat. I'm sorry, Sting. I'm sorry. Don't give up, Natsu. Not until the very end. That's the way of all fire dragons." He hesitated briefly. He could end this now, but he waited. Why was he giving them the chance to hear their final goodbyes? Ah. It had to be because of Rogue. The man couldn't stop him, but he could at least delay him long enough for these precious few moments. In the end, it hardly mattered to him. He swung, and a wave of devastating magic was unleashed. The dragons lunged forward against it, unleashing what little strength they had left, and in the end they even surprised him. The last of their strength broke against it, but it weakened it, enough so that their own bodies took up the brunt of the rest. He could take satisfaction in that, though. He never got old at enjoying the feeling of watching a dragon's body breaking under his magic, even if these were half-dead ones already. This has changed nothing. He called out mockingly, raising his hand once more and charging up magic within his palm to release. He couldn't help but let out a laugh as he watched their hopes shatter once more at the sight of yet another attack. Even if they stopped this one, they knew the truth. He could keep doing this. They couldn't. He had done it. He couldn't stop the grin that appeared on his face, one not tied down by arrogance or hatred but instead pure relief and joy. This was the end. The end to all the accursed dragons. A completion of his revenge. 400 years he had waited for this moment. He had been worried about what this would mean after it was done, but the feeling he had right now made him not even care. Finally. Finally, he roared out in joy, extending out his hand reach to wipe out the last of all things dragon. He didn't have to be driven by an endless hunt anymore. He didn't have to deal with the constant knowledge that he hadn't yet achieved his goal. For the first time in so long, he might actually be able to find peace. I win. And then he heard a gunshot and felt something hit the side of the hole in his chest. Protector of the fairies. A demon's forked tongue. He almost stumbled forward as a feeling rippled throughout his body. For a brief moment he almost considered it to be pain. But it wasn't. Not in the typical sense. Another sound like the one before whistled through the air, but he swiftly dodged it, allowing it to scrap past his arm and hit one of the scales across it, leaving a trail of purple mist where it touched. He recognized the feeling of this magic. Not the person behind it per se, but the type of magic it was. Godslayer magic. With a mist like this it could only be poison, and if there was anything Godslayers were known for, it was their abundance of raw power over everything else. It also meant the poison of a god would surpass all others in its potency. Another shot went towards him and he narrowly dodged it, his eyes tracking the projectile's path back to the source. The shooter was up high, appearing to be perched on the edge of an outcrop of rock in the far distance. The energy he had built up, meant to be used on the dragon slayers now behind him, gained a new target, and he unleashed the blast in one go towards the one who had dared to strike him in his moment of victory. Within moments his magic had shot across the vast distance and torn a hole into the landscape, ridding his attacker of their little hiding spot and hopefully wiping them out in the process. Even if it hadn't, it would delay them a bit. Long enough for him to finish what he had started. Turning back to the dragon slayers, he saw some of them struggling to try and get up, looking like they had tried to take advantage of his openings. Even if they had tried, it would have made no difference. They had little magic left to call upon, and certainly not enough to harm him in any way. He could crush them with ease. And yet as he took a step towards them, watching them seem to lean back as if hoping to keep the small distance as wide as they could, he stumbled once again, falling to his knees and having to hold himself up with his sole hand. What? What was going on? What was happening to him? It still wasn't pain, but that same feeling as before continued to pulse throughout his body, sapping his strength with every moment. As he struggled to push himself back to his feet, he found it a far more daunting task than he had ever imagined. His strength was being sapped. It was being eroded away, like there was a poison in his veins. He frowned slowly before his eyes trailed down towards his chest, his hand coming up to the hole and letting a finger touch the blood. It hurt to poke around, but he quickly found some of it turning black as he pushed in further, a dark mist coming back with his finger. It itched at the scales on his finger, but it couldn't penetrate them. His scales were too tough, even for a god's poison. But his wound was another matter. Lacking any scales or defenses, it was an open path to his body's internal functions. A poison like this would have little trouble overcoming his body's natural defenses too. It was a very different type of poison compared to those of dragons, one that was proving superior to them in affecting him. He wasn't. Was he dying? With every moment his strength faded without halting. With every passing second his body felt more sluggish, with even the simplest of commands taking a moment to be registered. This wasn't how this was supposed to be. It wasn't right. It wasn't fair. 400 years he had spent killing, waiting, sleeping, more waiting, and now finally a chance to finish it all for good. He wasn't meant to die now though. This was meant to be his moment of triumph. The moment where he would finally be free of dragons once and for all. To never have the world suffering with their accursed existences ever again. Everything had been for this. Everything. And it was going to end now? Right at the peak? He hadn't known what would come next. Hadn't wanted to. Knowing had made him question too much. Had given Rogue too much influence. So he hadn't. All that had mattered was the dragons. Killing them, getting his revenge, those were his goals. What came after would be decided then. But dying now was too soon. He wouldn't even get a chance to think about that any further. There no longer was a future. He was going to die. I suppose that's not a bad thing, he muttered softly, bringing his hand back to stare at it and its dragon-like qualities. Even if he could take on human form, it didn't change what he was. He was a dragon, just like those he had slaughtered. Just like those he hated. In the end he might very well have taken his own life to get rid of the final beast. Himself. Whoever this god-slayer was, it appeared them had simply speed up the process. He would die, and the last of the dragons would go with him. Fitting in a way. Despite what happened, he would still have done it. Done what many said was impossible. What many believed was impossible. And what many wished was possible. But he wasn't done yet. Not yet. Raising his hand up, Her reached for his magic and tried to bring it back into focus, the energy shifting restlessly in his hand. It was hard to form. His magical power was so vast that even in death he had so much to pull from. But his control was another matter. His mind would shift and flicker, finding it hard to focus on the energy that was getting ever more unstable in the palm of his hand. Not yet. He growled out, taking a step forward to get closer to the dragon slayers before stumbling down to one knee, struggling to keep himself upright. He held his hand out forward, the deadly energy growing as he used his obsession to focus everything he had onto the one task he had left. Even if he collapsed afterwards, even if he became unable to move until he died helplessly, he had to do this. He was still Acknowledge. The mightiest dragon. The one that did the impossible and killed all dragons. And these were the last, the ones that would bring his legend to its conclusion. Until they fell, nothing was over. He couldn't allow himself to fall until they died. Otherwise it would have all been for nothing. He almost had it. The magic was threatening to implode in his hand, but he managed to keep it steady out of pure will. It could do whatever it wanted once he released it, so long as it took all of them with it. Then he would still win. His mind almost closed off then and there, but he forced himself to snap back to focus, even as his strength drained further and further. It was fine though. He had everything he needed now. With this, it would all end. With this, he would finally win. He felt himself freeze as he met those pair of eyes. They stared at him, so desperately, and appeared to scream at him not to do this. No, not scream. Beg. Those eyes, Sting's eyes, were begging him to stop. They shouldn't have made him even hesitate. Sting meant nothing to him. He was just another to die. To bring about his victory. With that in mind, he prepared to unleash his magic when he felt it slip through his fingers. I win. A voice spoke those words to him in his mind. It was a familiar voice to him, though one that rarely spoken up. A broken man had little to say to the monster he had created. But for the first time in 400 years, there was something else in it. Something he had lost since believed lost to Rogue. Relief. His hand fell to his side as the last of the magic in his palm faded. His arm had failed him because of the poison, but he hadn't let the magic go. Rogue had. So you, finally had, a reason, to act, he muttered to the one within him, feeling his consciousness slipping away. Whether it was because they were dying or because Rogue had stepped completely out of his self-imposed isolation, he didn't know. He supposed it didn't matter. In the end, the result was still the same. He had wanted to end the dragons. To kill them all, and all who bared their power. But that desire had come from Rogue. It had always been his pain and need for vengeance that had created him. He had been allowed to do as he pleased because it was easy for Rogue to let him do that. It let Rogue drown in his sorrows while he did the one thing that gave him true joy in the world. Fighting and killing dragons. But in the end, that freedom was allowed. And now it was taken. What made now different than before? He found himself meeting the eyes of Sting, the boy who had triggered something to make Rogue act. It had brought Rogue out before, but the man had still retreated back and let him run wild. So why stop him from killing them now when there could have been so many chances before? Even if they had been Rogue's friends, they still had the power that they both hated so much. It was because this was the end. Rogue wasn't sparing Sting because he was his friend. That had only sparked him awake once more. Rogue was sparing them because he would perish instead. Even in death, Rogue hated dragons like he did. It was a dark desire that had engulfed their hearts, and even now it wasn't any weaker. If Rogue had spared them before, it would never have lasted long. He would have eventually been unable to cope and would have attacked them out of rage. Neither could accept the existence of dragons in this world. But it was different now. Rogue could accept them living because he would be incapable of acting against them any further. In your last moments, you're saving dragons. He managed to force out. How disappointing. I wanted to at least. He hoped Rogue was happy with this. He would end up fading away, becoming part of Rogue once more. It would be Rogue that would have to take this burden to the grave. He just wished he had more time. The eyes of Acknowledge closed briefly as a soft smile grew across the face of the dragon. When the eyes opened once more, they did for one final time. Pure joy appeared to dance through them as the body began to slump forward, vision going hazy for the one looking through those eyes. Finally, Rogue said as he gave up resisting, his body hitting the ground as he drew his last breaths. It's finally over. Protector of the Fairies. Staring at the body, Sting half thought it would suddenly get back up at the drop of a hat. After the whole chaos the fight had brought, seeing his old friend unmoving like this seemed like a trap. What if it was? What if Acknowledge was trying to lure them in to finish them in one go? Ideas like that persisted for a few more moments before eventually being dismissed entirely. Those techniques hadn't been used once by Acknowledge. Not once had Acknowledge been truly defenseless in their entire fight. Even his mistakes still had him come out on top, and at the end they had been at his mercy. Right before Acknowledge fell, he could have finished them off. He had won. Some of the others saw it as pure lucky that Acknowledge collapsed when he did. They believed he had run out of steam at that last moment from whatever had caused him to collapse. But he had seen differently. He couldn't have missed the way Acknowledge's face had changed, his expression softening to one he was more familiar with. They could celebrate their victory as much as they wanted, but in the end it was Rogue who allowed them the chance to do so. When Acknowledge could have killed them once and for all, even in his last moments, Rogue resurfaced and stopped him. It was the only reason they'd been spared. Telling the others this though, he wasn't sure they'd care. They hadn't known Rogue as well as he did, but that had hardly changed their willingness to fight him. In the end, Rogue and Acknowledge had both been distant faces to all but him. You don't seem happy, spoke God Serena, the man depositing himself next to him and groaning as he caused his chest to ache from its wound. We finally managed it. Acknowledge was finally destroyed. He was still my friend. I'm glad we all survived this, but this ending isn't the one I wanted. I suppose not, God Serena mused. I can't really relate. I'm not even like the lot of you that had dragons. My only reason to fight Acknowledge came from a mixture of pride and guilt. Guilt. God Serena nodded. My condition. Well, let's just say it wasn't easy to create. Acquiring the lacrima alone was tough, but implanting them was a whole other issue in itself. It leaked out a lot of magic too, a lot of dragon magic, and Acknowledge. He quickly caught on to what God Serena was implying. He came. Yeah, the man muttered with a sigh. I'd left earlier than morning by chance, my magic having stabilized down, and I was looking for something nearby to fight to get an idea of my new abilities. I saw the light in the distance, and when I returned, the city I'd been staying in was gone. Only a single soul was left alive, and I only hoped the rest had died instantly. Ever since that day. Well, I think I can finally move past it after all these years. At least you'll be able to, he muttered as he glanced over towards Laxus, doing his best to try and comfort Wendy. She didn't look as bad as she did before, though the cracks remained across her skin where her body had begun to break from the sheer amount of magical power being drawn into her body. They all had cracks of their own at this point as a result of her keeping them going too, but it was hardly noticeable in comparison. While physically she looked better though, he doubted that the same could have been said for her mental state. She wasn't crying anymore, but he assumed it wasn't for a lack of trying, but rather she couldn't shed any more tears. Her eyes were still red and she was barely saying anything, which he didn't know if it was better than her previous screaming or not. There was also the blood to take into account. Her usual blue hair was partial red in areas, and the front of her had patches of blood still soaking into her clothes. If it was her own blood it would have been a terrible sight. But it wasn't. It was her mother's. He saw her slowly separate from Laxus and approach Rogue's body, her a blank look. He hadn't a clue what she intended to do until she crouched down beside it and weakly swung a fist down on Rogue's motionless corpse. For an instant he was just about ready to leap at her and tear her away. That was his friend's corpse. Whether he had been an enemy or not, the least he could do for his friend's memory would give him a proper burial and the respect the dead deserved. Only God Serena's tight grip on his arm stopped him long enough for him to see past the wall of red that had colored his vision. She was young. Younger than all of them, and honestly far too young to have been placed on a battlefield. She could act as irresponsible and mature as she wanted, but in the end she was but a child. She still had a child's innocence, a brightness that age tended to dull. And because of Acknowledge's actions, he was sure it had dulled a lot today. She could be so kind when she spoke, but none of that could remain when faced with the monster who killed her own mother. No, it had to be even worse than that. The first thing she had probably seen when she realized what was going on was her mother's dead corpse lying over her, protecting her from harm and having paid the ultimate price for it. To a child, a parent was one of the most precious things imaginable. Losing Vaislaja had been tough, but his memories, and he now wasn't sure how real those were since he remembered his father dying, had reminded him it was for a greater good. That it was what Vaislaja wanted. If it had been someone else who killed Vaislaja, well, he would have probably have hated them just as much as he recognized Wendy hated Acknowledger right now. Now this is a depressing sight, Ziraf stated as he approached them all, coming to a stop a small distance away as he watched each member of the group before finally turning his attention to God Serena. At the very least I thought you'd be celebrating more. This really isn't the best time, God Serena replied, shooting looks at each of the other dragon slayers. We've won. But the victory isn't what everyone wanted. It never would have been, Ziraf pointed out uncaringly. Frankly, there are more of you left than I ever anticipated. I was sure only half of us would have survived at best, and I was including myself in that number. Ziraf briefly shot a glance towards Gajil. I was sure you'd be the first to die. Screw you. I am glad that this chapter is finally over though, said Ziraf, ignoring Gajil entirely as he looked towards Acknowledge's body. It took 400 years, but the monster that plagued those times has finally been destroyed. That was my friend, you know, Sting pointed out quietly, just loud enough for Ziraf to hear him. I realize this is how it all was going to end. But it doesn't mean I appreciate it. He deserved better than to live a life of pain. It is a shame, Ziraf muttered. Sting wasn't sure if Ziraf really meant those words or if they were just meant to be reassuring to them. He even managed to find hope after everything that once happened. Yeah, Sting responded quietly. Until the dragons came. He had never really had to think much on the civil war the dragons had supposed had, but he imagined it must have been hell to live in if you weren't under the protection of an organization of some kind. How many had likely died in the same way that Rogue's wife had? How many had felt the same as Rogue had but simply hadn't been gifted with the same magic and talent? If they hadn't found him. Indeed. It almost makes me regret directing them that way. Yeah. If you hadn't. The words fell away as his mind caught up with what Ziraf had said. It was like a bucket of cold water had been thrown over him, and he felt every little distraction fade away as he focused on those words alone. What did you just say? Oh? I suppose saying it like that does make it sound quite bad. Then what did you mean to say? He demanded, his head snapping towards Ziraf. He didn't know what he had hoped to see there. Some guilt. Maybe regret even. Hell, he would have taken a bit of confliction if he needed to. Something to make the man before him appear anything than what he actually was. Because the reality was that the man before him only looked a bit puzzled as he tried to pick out some different words. There was no guilt for what he had said. No apologies there or issues he had with the words. It appeared as if they had been merely said, meaning nothing to the man before him. Ah, perhaps this would make it sound better. I had the unfortunate luck to be working on some projects when the dragons discovered me, and unfortunately they managed to follow the way I fled and destroyed anything in their path that they believed I might have been hiding in. Does that make it sound better? It didn't. It might have done if not for the cold look in Ziref's eyes. And it was at that moment that he knew. You wanted this, he muttered, loud enough to ensure the others could hear. You wanted Rogue to become Acknowledger. I didn't want him to become Acknowledger. Did you see how much trouble it took to get rid of him? But you wouldn't know that then, Sting stated, anger bubbling up instead as Ziref still refused to show any other emotion than the ones he had right now. All you knew is that he was sent back in time to a moment you were there. And that Rogue couldn't settle down around you because of your future self. The dots were connecting. People said Ziref had played a part in Acknowledge's creation. That he was responsible for his strength. Stories some might call them. Rumors even. But if even a slither was true, you couldn't deal with the dragons by yourself, could you? For all your strength, you weren't powerful enough back then. In the stories they talk about your demons spreading across the lands, but how could they do that with the dragons having a war across it? They couldn't, he continued. Not while their numbers were that large at least. You needed the dragons gone. You needed a weapon. And then one fell right in your lap. Ziref shrugged, only making him angrier. Some of what you say is true. I could deal with the dragons myself by once they grouped together, things became different. I tried a lot of methods to reduce their numbers. I would lure them over to the lands of the Shinigami and Quincy and let them die through flames or arrows. I could draw them in so that two groups ended up fighting and killing one another. But all of it was so slow. And even with all my best efforts, I barely put a dent in their numbers. Demons provided fairly ineffective, Ziref added with a wave towards Natsu. I had yet to perfect my initial Aetherius series demons, and the others I had made found it difficult to stand up to dragons, even when I created large numbers of them. They simply lacked the firepower necessary. Numbers mean nothing against dragons unless you can actually fell the beasts. And then I heard about them. Dragon Slayers. At this Ziref gestured around at all of them. You are all peak examples of what your kind can do, but even the weakest from back then was nothing to scoff at when I compared the work they could do against the work my demons could. Problem is, one side of dragons would eat me if I approached them, and the other at that point had learned not to trust me. I was stuck, without the means to obtain the magic I needed. Lowering his hand, Ziref shot them a small grin of amusement. And then I remembered. There was one out there. I wasn't expecting much at first, but I did remember the magic Rogue possessed. There was little way I wouldn't after the brief time he spent in my company. And it helped that I had a demon or two keeping an eye on him so I could ever find him again if I needed to. It was ridiculously easy to track him down after that, added Ziref. But when I did, I found him quite different from how he was before. It wasn't quite what I expected. He was happy, you bastard. Sting roared, having to hold himself back from slugging his fist into the Dark Mage's face. The only reason he hadn't was because the Dark Mage looked like he was expecting him to do just that, which could only mean it would do nothing or the Dark Mage would stop him first. Happiness, Ziref muttered, sounding like he found the word distasteful. Yes, he was quite happy. He was very different from the man I met before. And that was a problem, you see. The fire I remembered had dimmed. It wasn't out, but it was nowhere near the inferno it had once been. I didn't need that full flame. I needed the blaze. And so you killed everyone. Ziref seemed to frown under his accusation. Killed everyone? No, I did no such thing. I didn't harm a single person in that village. You can't claim to be innocent when your goal was their deaths anyway, growled out Gajeel. All you did was not bloody your own hands. Did I make them do anything? Ziref shook his head. I cannot be held responsible for their actions. But you knew what they'd do, Sting argued. You knew they'd kill everyone they found. Of course, Ziref replied, without a shred of guilt. For Rogue to become what I needed, he had to feel that same pain as before. It had to burn brighter than ever. That woman he loved. Well, she was in the way. I would have acted myself if it would have produced what I wanted, but it wouldn't have lit the spark. By if a dragon killed her, well, it is merely reinforcing the idea inside Rogue's head of how everything he loves is taken from him and that at the center is always a dragon. And you, Natsu snarled out. You're at the center of it too. Far more than any of the dragons. Why the hell did Rogue even help you after what you did? If I did, I wouldn't have. He didn't know. Natsu stared at Ziref coldly for a moment, almost as if he was trying to recognize the man in front of him but couldn't. 400 years and he never knew his hatred was aimed at an entirely wrong place. And you don't even seem to feel anything because of that. Does it even matter? Ziref asked. I did everyone a favor in the first place. By creating Acknowledge, it could be said that I even saved the world. One man's suffering is more than enough of a fair trade to ensure the world's survival and freedom from dragons. Don't even pretend like this was for some greater good, Laxus snapped out. This was for your own sick benefit. Everyone benefited, not just myself. You can hardly said it was an unfair deal. Your Majesty, we should leave, God Serena stated urgently, taking a position in front of Ziref as the rest of them did their best to keep themselves under control. August should have already secured a path through the barrier for us to follow and dash. Through the barrier. Laxus took a step forward angrily, trying not to lunge in recklessly. You backstabbing son of Dash. I am merely taking advantage of the opportunities before me, Ziref pointed out. You knew I wouldn't play fair from the start, so why be surprised now? I was never going to stay quiet while the abomination is too far away to stop me. I do wonder what he'll think when he comes back to find his precious friends' rotting bodies. Your Majesty, we should leave. Not yet, Ziref shot back at God Serena's insistence. Because you see, I quite like this current moment. With Acknowledge gone, the last real threat on this continent has passed. I can do whatever the hell I want for the next few days, at least until the other Ukin return. The things a sole Ukin can do when not opposed. Tell me, did Juushiro see this coming? God Serena frowned, glancing back towards Ziref briefly. Juushiro? What does he dash? He never finished his words, the wave of death magic hitting him before he had a chance to move away. The others wasted no time leaping back as far as they could in their injured states, unable to anything but watch as the lifeless body of God Serena fell down to the ground. And there removes one of the last little pests running around, Ziref stated, sparing a look at them all. What? That was your own ally, Natsu muttered in disbelief. He was protecting you. No, he was protecting his cover, Ziref stated, giving the corpse at his feet a kick. He thought he was so clever. Him and Jin. And for a while I wasn't sure. But I caught on eventually. How do you think Aetherian got its coordinates to fire at? Because the spies in my camp knew where to direct it and only my Spriggan 12 had the knowledge. For a long time now he's been whispering every little detail into Juushiro's ear, doing the man's bidding so long as he'd have the chance to take down Acknowledge once and for all. I couldn't risk allowing him a chance to fight back and ruin my current chances either. Because you see, I've decided on something, Ziref continued. I've tried. I've tried so many times. And in the end, it doesn't make a difference. This world continues to crush at my goals, removing them one by one. So why not just go wild and cause as much destruction as I can? I built up Alvarez. I can always do the same with Ishtar in a few centuries from now. I just first need to break the will of those living here and scatter them to the four corners. Starting with you lot, of course. You think it'll be that easy? Laxus asked, lightning sparking to life. And then dying. Oh yes, Ziref said, taking steps closer now and forcing them to each back off further away from the dark mage. Having trouble activating your magic? I'm amazed you even have much left to attempt anything at all. Laxus snarled out a response before shooting looks at the others. Fall back. I'll buy as much time as I can and dash. You'll die. And then they will, Ziref stated without leaving room for argument. Even Natsu, I'm afraid. If you aren't how my brother was, you are no longer worth keeping alive. I'll at least seal your soul away in your book once more in case I can recover anything after your death. Step back step they continued backing away, Ziref increasing his pace ever so slightly. Sting had a feeling he knew what the Dark Mage wanted. He wanted them to run. To flee like rats and to be caught one by one and eliminated. Ziref was playing with them, because now there was nothing they could do to even stand against him. Who to go for first? How about you? In a few moments, many things happened. Ziref closed the distance between them with shadows, a dark sinister smile across his face as he prepared to unleash his magic. The air became heavier at the same time, and an odd sound filled the air. Light shone down from the sky, a pillar of it landing around Wendy and enveloping her. Ziref hesitated briefly, turning back even when so close to him, knowing he had little to fear. And then shadows struck, and tore the dark mage's arm from his body. Protector of the fairies. The flickering embers of a dying shadow. Losing an arm, even if only temporarily, was never a fun experience. First there was the pain as the arm was severed. This time was easier to bear than most, the attack that had smashed into his arm and torn it from his body, doing so in a clean fashion. Then came the next bit of pain, as his body began to scream out as the signals reached his brain. Then finally there was the moment of imbalance that he was always quick to ignore. It never lasted long. By the time he was turning, his arm would be back. That was how it always was. The attack just now did as little permanent damage to him as everything else did. So as he turned towards his attacker, he didn't even bother getting worried at a newcomer's appearance and instead focused on trying to work out who they were. There were dozens of people he had in mind, with a few making the top of his list. The one he saw hadn't even made the top 50. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered, taking in the sight of a moving acknowledger, the man's arm still stretched out with shadows lingering across its surface. I thought you were dead. I guess it takes a bit longer than I thought for you to succumb to such deadly poison. Though I think you aimed at the wrong targets here. No. I aimed at the right ones, Ziref. Do I look like a dragon too? Oh. He understood now. Those shadows should have clued him in. Even if Acknowledger could use them, the one who favored them this much was always the original. This isn't Acknowledger, is it? Hello, Rogue. It's been a long time, hasn't it? 400 years. 400 years since you murdered Sonia. He sighed. None of them truly could grasp this, could they? I didn't kill her, nor anyone there, as I explained to the rest of these fools. But then I suppose that doesn't matter much to you. You committed genocide because you lost a cat and a wife. You just love to aim your hatred at, well, anything. Still, I'm surprised you can focus it on me. Unless... Did Rogue already know? How long? How long do you think? Rogue spat out. You approached me too quickly afterwards. It was a month afterwards. And yet it reeked to my nose. It was too timed. Too precise. What's more, you were so quick to offer your aid to help me in my quest. I had no real proof, of course, and the part of me that was acknowledged didn't even care. But the little bit of me that could still think reasonable never could let those doubts go. And so you hung on to them for 400 years, he muttered. Surprising. You never acted on anything before. I would have thought it would have made you even a little bit less cooperative. Or, perhaps it didn't matter? Am I correct? Rogue didn't answer him, but he knew he was. It didn't matter how many doubts or suspicions Rogue had if it was always Acknowledger in control. This is the first day you've ever completely come back to your normal self, he mused. Likely a result of your old friend acting as the stimulus required to jolt you awake, but only briefly. Your own rage against the dragons drowned everything else out, even your own doubts about me. You could try and make your other self notice, but he didn't care, did he? Especially when today should be the first day you had those doubts confirmed. Did you enjoy getting proven right? It was fine. No, go on. I don't mind. Let me guess. Were you happy? Happy to know you hadn't been clinging to a wrong conclusion for 400 years? I think it could easily break a person if they realized they had been wrong entirely. All right, Rogue admitted. It was satisfying. Satisfying to know I had been right to suspect you. And satisfying to know all my efforts over these long years was worth it in the end. Was Rogue truly serious? Looking at the man's face, he could easily see that he was. There was even the hints of smugness there. All because he had done one lousily sneak attack? It made him want to laugh. Hell, he wouldn't even try and stop himself. It was worth making fun of. Efforts? To do what? Attack me. He brought his laughter to a halt as he leveled a cold glare at the man before him. I'm immortal. A being who cannot be harmed, let alone killed. I hope it was satisfying to get one final hit in, because you will simply perish soon having achieved nothing, Rogue. Is that so? This time their roles seemed to be reversed, Rogue laughing as he brought his soul hand up and ran it absent-mindedly through his hair. I wondered if it would even work, you know. Rogue managed to get out between breaths. The idea didn't start to form until 216 years ago, and even then it took another 100 till I believed I had it all planned out. But even then, I had been forced to give up on it. The circumstances alone would have taken the luck of a god to obtain, and yet somehow fortune finally decided to smile my way again after all the hell I had been put through. And looking at you now. You don't even realize, do you? Realize what? My god, you don't. Have you not even noticed? Or are just so used to ignoring pain that you haven't realized that it should have stopped by now? What on earth are you talking about? Had Rogue gone mad? It certainly sounded like it. Talking about pain that he should apparently be feeling and such, nonsense. Huh? He could feel pain still. How long had that been going on for? He was so used to shutting it out that he did it instinctively, but if he focused he could feel the constant ache that tried to break through that block. What was causing it? He frowned as he tried to think, wondering if perhaps the shadows had done something. An attempt to tear him apart from the inside, maybe? Or were they attempting to erode him away somewhere? No, one of that could be right. Rogue had already seen him get completely disintegrated today and found that all it merely delayed him a bit longer than normal. Rogue wouldn't be this happy over an attack that was simply eroding away at his body faster than it would normally recover. Carefully observing Rogue, he noticed how the man's eyes, smug as they were, seemed to glance at his feet on occasion. It was obvious too, obvious enough that he suspected it was on purpose. Did Rogue want him to look? For most it would be foolish to ignore a foe who could strike so quickly, but what did he have to fear? So he looked down for a moment, taking in the growing pool of blood at his feet. Wait? Blood? Whose blood was that? It was growing still, so it wasn't old blood from the battle, and it certainly hadn't been there last time he checked. If it had merely been from his arm being briefly severed, then he could have accepted it, but this was too much blood for such a brief wound. This amount could have only come from one that continued to bleed profusely. Oddly, he thought he could see the source. It was coming from his right side, almost as if... No. No. No, 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 no. There's the look I waited so long to see. This wasn't happening. Not right now. Not because of this beast. His eyes traced up towards the socket of his right arm, expecting to see it attached there to his shoulder. He'd hoped it could have set his fears at rest. All his efforts rewarded him with was the opposite. It was gone. His arm was gone, and as he turned his head a bit more he could see it lying there on the cold ground a few feet away. Without realizing, he found his feet moving towards it, then bending down and plucking it from the ground. He tried to keep a calm exterior, but as he turned back towards Rogue he knew he hadn't been even the slightest bit successful. Go on. I know what you want to do. Try it. He did. He pressed his arm right back up against the socket, even though part of him had known this was a futile exercise. That part of him had understood the moment he had seen his missing limb that it wouldn't be able to be reattached. Perhaps if he kept it fresh and operated on himself fast enough it could work. But if that could work, his arm would already be reattached to him. Even as he tried to press it back in place, he could actively feel his immortality pressing back at it. His arm wasn't registered as a part of him anymore. Except that should have been impossible. All Rogue had done was sever it. That was all that had been done. It was hardly something to praise anyone about, and it had happened so many times. So why was this different? What on earth did Rogue do? How? How did you do it? Was he shouting? His voice sounded like it was, and he could hear the panic in his words. He couldn't even pretend like he wasn't. He was confused, and he was terrified of this new situation. Rogue chuckled, waving a finger around like he was lecturing with it. How indeed? Do you know what I am right now? I don't care. He roared out. He needed to know. Answer me. I am, so be patient, Rogue shot back, looking amused at the fury directed his way. Right now, I'm gone. Dead. Might as well be 6 feet under at this point, and nothing happening now is changing that. This isn't me surviving the poison for a bit longer. I've already succumbed to it. You're dead? But how? His eyes snapped to one side, seeing the girl sitting behind the dragon. He'd paid her so little heed that he had forgotten she had even been sitting near Rogue's body. And now that he was noticing her, he could see what she had surrounded the area around her with. Runes. Runes for a spell currently active. Sky magic. Yes. Right now Wendy here is pulling my soul out from the other side. And I'm sure when this normally happens we just form an illusionary body and inhabit that until the spell ends. But then most of the time when this spell is cast, the target died long ago. Even an hour is enough time, but I died only a few minutes ago. My body may have died, but my magic has yet to fully leave it. And so you can continue to inhabit it, he muttered in realization. Like a possession, only using your own magic as the binding force to hold you in place. Which makes you. His words trailed off, but it appeared Rogue was aware of what he was going to say, the man throwing an insufferable smirk his way. So you have an idea of what I am currently. I'm a dead soul. But I'm currently inhabiting my physical body, with access to my draining magical power. I can't stop that, this body is already dead like I am. But until the magic fades, there is still a bit of life left connected to me. While I'm in this body, one could say I lie in the boundary. A dead soul, being pulled over temporarily from the other side, using the power only the living possess. And my own power to boot. It's a contradiction, isn't it, to be living and dead like this? The same as you. You, how did you? It wasn't possible. No one had realized this. Or if they had, no one had ever been able to act on it. You can't have. Rogue nodded at his shock. That was why for so long I had to face the facts that I would never be able to do anything. I realized how to harm you, but I'd never be able to do it. Your state isn't one that can be replicated easily. Even my current state is a mere shadow to what I was truly after. But just stepping into this territory is enough. How much did you realize? A lot. And I heard a lot too during the years. About how you were cursed to die. About how magic desired you to live as one of its Ukin. Eventually those two forces made you what you are today. You embody the concept of life and death at once because neither of those two forces could claim you for their own. Even your own nature is a tangled mess. You're living but also dying, stuck in that point in between where nothing can ever reach you. Unless, of course, they could enter that same realm you have solely occupied. I waited so long, Rogue added darkly. All those years, holding on to those thoughts as a what if. So that if I one day got the chance, I'd kill you once and for all. I'd hoped to take your head off in that first strike, but I suppose an arm will do for the moment. And you know the best part? Rogue asked. You aren't healing because what you are right now is how you will always be. You keep defaulting back to the same state every time someone pushes you off to one side. I destroy your body, it goes right back to normal. If you had any lingering cuts or scars from before this fully kicked in, they might even still be there, stuck since you exist in this permanent state. But that is only when the forces outside of your realm try to harm you. But right now I'm different. I reached into your realm and took your arm. I did something not even you can achieve, and because of that there is no longer anything there to put it back to normal. This is my revenge. Rogue roared out, bringing his hand into a fist and pointing it towards Rogue. Your wound will never heal. It will constantly bleed, the pain never vanishing. Your arm will never return because your body no longer has the blueprint it needs to bring it back. And even if you manage to stop me now, no one will ever be able to look at you and see the invincible immortal. Even if it would take another few centuries, people will realize what needs to be done to harm you again like I did. And they'll kill you, even if it takes piece by piece. But why wait until then? Rogue added as he took a step forward. Why don't I just finish this, once and for all? Panic flooded his body, and as Rogue waved his hand and threw forth another wave, he quickly ducked beneath the now deadly magic. He wanted to refute Rogue's words, to call out his lies. But how could he do that when he knew every one of them was true? What's wrong? Didn't you once say you wished to die? Didn't you once spend years looking for a way to die? He had, it was true. But right now he didn't want to die. He had goals, objectives, motivation, and a whole variety of things to pass his time. But most of all, this wasn't how he wanted to die. The choice to die was one he wished to make himself, to act upon it himself. It was not one he wished to be taken away from him. Not like it had been for so many others. Which meant he had to get away. More waves of shadows rose up in pursuit of him, Rogue arrogantly watching him from a distance. If the man wanted to, he could close the distance now and end it. Even with rapidly draining magical power, such a feat was easily possible for Rogue. But he wasn't. No, he was instead being played with by Rogue. It was arrogant. It was insulting. And it was all definitely intentional. All for a single purpose. To make him run, afraid of the incoming death. This isn't over, Rogue. He roared out, barely dodging a wave of shadows as the rest began to close in, trapping him behind a wave of darkness about to crush him. One day you'll regret this. No, I don't think I will, he heard Rogue said in response before he was forced to flee back into the shadows behind him, the wave of darkness crashing into the ground where he had once stood. He could have come back out nearby, or even hid there. But the shadows weren't safe if Rogue was here and went to them. So he did the one thing he hated to do. He ran. He ran and ran and ran, fleeing as fast as he could away from the first man he had ever met that had been capable of killing him. Protector of the Fairies. Oh, thank God, he's gone, Rogue said, having waited patiently for a full minute to be sure. Without warning, he quickly collapsed back, landing on his butt and resting his hand behind him as support. I was afraid he wouldn't have fled for a moment there. So you're done? Wendy asked him coldly. Good. Now go back and dash. Wait, Wendy. Sting begged, grabbing her hand as she tried to rub away one of the runes she had traced across the ground. Looking back at Rogue, he hesitantly reached out to him with his other hand, poking the man's shoulder briefly and looking like he expected it to get ripped off. What? Rogue asked him, trying to laugh Sting's fears off but had to look away after a moment from guilt. Suppose that reaction is fair enough, he muttered out quietly. Hello, Sting. It's you. You're back again. You are back, right? If you're worried Acknowledge is going to come out and kill you all, he won't, Rogue answered him calmly. Acknowledge is gone. He was merely a part of me, and with my final moments I took back control. With that, and my death, Acknowledge became unnecessary to me. I'm sure he's in here somewhere. Please wait, Wendy. Rogue had to bow his head deeply to get her to pause from trying to reach out for a different rune with her other hand. A few minutes. That's all I ask for. Please. I hate you, Wendy replied, her voice filled with ice as she stared at Rogue loathingly. You're still him. Even if you say you're not, Acknowledge is still you. And because of you, Grandini is. Her voice broke slightly, causing her gaze to waver from grief. She'd still be here if it wasn't for you. I know, Rogue replied quietly, glancing towards the other dragon slayers. I've done things I'm not proud of. Performs acts and sins that are worth being cursed for. Taking your mother, and the lives of the other dragons today, is not the first pebble in this pond. But I'm not asking for myself. Please. For Sting's sake. Wendy spared a glance his way, looking extremely hesitant at the idea, and her resolve quickly weakened as he bowed his head before her, begging as well. Please, Wendy. Just let me talk to him for a bit. So I can at least say goodbye. Please. Wendy stayed silent for a few moments. He wanted to know what sort of face she was making, hoping it would give away some of her thoughts, but instead he settled for keeping his bowed, awaiting her answer desperately. Time seemed to drag on for an eternity. And then. Be quick, Wendy whispered softly, barely loud enough for them to hear. If he does anything, he'll disappear. And I'll only give you a few minutes at most. The last bits of my magic will run out after that. Thank you. Thank you so much. Just, hurry. As he raised his head he saw Wendy move away from the two of them, crawling over to the opposite side of the large circle of runes and watching Rogue like a hawk. Just looking at her, he knew she'd take any excuse to banish Rogue away. He couldn't truly blame her for that, but it meant he had to make every second matter. So of course the first thing he ended up uttering was the thing he wanted the most. How can we save you? There's no saving me, Rogue answered him tiredly, almost as if he had expected him to ask this. As much as you want to sting, you can't. I'm sorry. Why are you apologizing? He muttered in response. This isn't your fault. You were made a plaything of Zeref's. Forced to dance to his tune. It doesn't take away my own actions and guilt, Rogue replied back. I've done some terrible thing. Absolutely horrible things even. Zeref pushed me down this path. He sent me to a place where I had no one and then took away the bit of hope I managed to grasp. But he's still right. He didn't make me kill all those dragons. He didn't make him slaughter all the innocents who got in my way. Their blood is on both of our hands, his for purposefully creating the events which lead to acknowledge's formation in me and my own for giving in to my hatred and doing as I wished. But I don't want to dwell on this right now, Rogue added. Not when there's so little time left. Tell me, how is the guild? The guild. He frowned briefly before noticing the desperate look Rogue wasn't even trying to hide. Ah. He understood what Rogue wanted. Even if it had only been a few months for him, for Rogue it had been 400 years. There was no telling how much he remembered about them at all, nor how much he cared about. But he supposed neither of them truly cared. Rogue just wanted to talk, like how they used to so long ago for him. So he did as his friend wished. He brought up stories of how Rufus helped cheer up the camp they stayed in with displays of magic and colorful light shows and stories, even though he was exhausted himself and was ready to collapse the second he stopped. He told tales of how Renji helped fend off dozens of squads of soldiers as they fell back, and came back bloody and bruised by the end but still alive like the rest of them had been that day. He even threw in some of Orga's recent boosts from his experience fighting a god, getting a chuckle out of Rogue who commented how tricky such beings were to fight. But all of that inevitable came to an end. He was aware more than just a few minutes had passed and that Rogue was still here. Wendy wasn't cruel enough to interrupt them, but she couldn't keep this up forever. A quick glance towards her showed she was straining to keep going, and Rogue himself occasionally seemed to pause unwillingly and continue halfway into a sentence. They both knew this was ending. Sting. All of you even, Rogue added after a moment of thought. Please be careful. I may have wounded Zeref but I may have made the situation worse for you all. I don't think he'll walk away from this war like he did 400 years ago. We'll handle it, he replied confidently before a thought crossed his mind. Hey. Could you have killed them? When you attacked I mean. You took his arm, but after that you didn't chase after him. That was an accident, Rogue muttered in shame. I was aiming for his head. I truly wished to kill him and spare all of you the fate of fighting and dying by his hand. But just because I was able to temporarily inhabit my body, it didn't mean I could use it as effectively as I could when I was alive. I misjudged my swing, and my aim ended up off. I was lucky to get his arm at all, and I knew I couldn't very well beat him after that. He would have dodged too much, and I realized my body's reflexes would be too slow. So you bluffed. Yeah, Rogue replied with a smile. And he fell for it, right? I knew if I made him afraid he'd flee. He's the kind of person who wishes to die, but will run when faced by that threat in battle. It's one of the few parts of him that he shares with the rest of us, and it's been a long time since he remembered that. If he had been able to calm down, he would have realized all he had to do was kill Wendy to remove me as a threat entirely. Rogue's arm suddenly lost its grip on the ground and it was only his quick actions that managed to catch his friend before he hit the ground. Not long left, Rogue muttered, leaning against him as he held his friend. If you can find someone who can replicate what I did, you can kill Zeref. But since that chance is extremely small, find a way to trap him. Even if he can't die, it doesn't mean he's unbeatable. At the very least he only has one arm now, so hopefully that will help even a little. Just Promise me something, Sting. What is it? He asked, watching how Rogue turned his head to look up at him with a desperate look in his eyes. Ziref will kill people. I know what he's like and I know what he's currently obsessed with. He's doing everything he can just to watch Ichigo Kurosaka break. He hated him, more than anyone else, and for that he'll kill hundreds of thousands if it means even a moment of pleasure from what he'll see. He has to be stopped, but he won't be stopped without cost. People you care about may die, indiscriminately or not, but if they do you can't let yourself do what I did. Even if you lose everything, don't become like me, Sting. I won't, he promised his friend. He didn't know if he was truly telling the truth or not though, not when he had no idea of what it would feel like to end up in the state Rogue was. He wasn't very good at hiding his expressions, and he was sure his doubt was visible to Rogue's eyes. But all he got from him was a laugh and a smile. I know you won't, Rogue said, looking happy even as his voice sounded sad. Because, you're better than me? What? That's not true. Yes it is, Rogue muttered. You were always the light to those around you. Even to me. I sometimes envied you for that, but I was happy being a shadow. It made it easier to hide how I could act when I was angry. I don't remember you being angry that much. Rogue merely continued to smile. That's because of you. I likely always had the hatred to become Acknowledger. Ziref poked and prodded it, but in my youth it was easy to give in to dark desires. And then I met you. You were so honest and bright. I envied that. But more than that, I wanted to live up to that. By being around you, I could be better than who I once was. That's why I'm sure of it, Rogue added sadly. If it had been you in my place, you would have found hope. You would have found a way to endure and make it home, and not be so weighed down by a mountain of corpses beneath your feet. And then, we could have laughed together some more. Gone on more adventures. Just, talked more. Rogue. He felt the first of his tears leave his eyes, not even bothering to try and hold them back as he clung to his friend. Please. There's got to be a way. You could still experience that. See another day. Another week. Another month. There's got to be a way. Your kind, Sting, Rogue replied back to him, growing weaker in his arms with each passing second. The runes around them were starting to dim now, barely giving off any light at all. Even after I spurned it before. I could have had that if I had been brave enough to stop myself sooner. But it's too late for me. But if we dash. Sting. Rogue's voice cut him off sharply, and as he looked at his friend Rogue was crying too, looking at him desperately. Let me die. What? Please, Rogue replied, practically begging as his voice grew weaker. Even with you here, even reliving what I missed, it hurts so much. Because I can't forgive them. A sob wrecked Rogue's body as he uttered those words, so filled with pain and sorrow as he screamed out the desires of his heart. I hate dragons, Rogue said to him. And Ziref. And given enough time, I'm sure I'll hate humans too. But I'll always hate dragons. When I close my eyes, I still hear Frosh's words over and over again. When I fall asleep, I see Sonia and her smile, and then I see what little remained of her after that dragon was done with her. Every moment was like a waking nightmare, and being Acknowledger was the only thing that ever helped forget even for a few minutes. Even with you here, I still want to kill you all. A part of me is desperately screaming out for your blood. And I don't want that. Not anymore. Not again. So please, Rogue begged. Let me go. Let me disappear once and for all. The world, it'll be better for it. Much better. So, let me go. He didn't want to. Not after he had been searching for his closest friend for so long. Not when he finally had him back. But he couldn't say any of that. Not to the look of the broken man in his arms, desperately begging for an end to a tragedy that he had never deserved. All right, he said softly, hating everything about this. Then rest. At least you'll be able to see them again. A bitter laugh left Rogue's throat as he uttered a response weakly, his eyes struggling to stay open. As if I'd see them again. Rogue managed to weakly shake his head, the effort taking away what little strength he had left. A monster like me would never get to go where they. Yes, you can, he replied honestly, doing his best to smile despite the situation. However, no response greeted him, making him realize the runes around them had finally stopped glowing. The body in his arms had stopped moving now, and he could no longer sense any of the magic of his old friend. All that was left was a still corpse that he couldn't help but to cling to, crying out in sorrow for the unjust fate of his oldest friend. Protector of the fairies. That was kind of you, Laxus said to Wendy. I know it was hard. I wanted to cut it off, Wendy said sharply, not looking towards the crying form of Sting as he clung to Rogue. I was within my right to, and I so wanted to every second I was looking at him. And yet you didn't. You even pushed yourself to keep the spell going longer, which I'm sure isn't doing you any favors right now. I'll manage, Wendy stated quietly. Besides, for a moment I almost forget Acknowledge was there. I hated him, but You don't need to explain yourself to me, he said to her, patting her on the head. You're a kind girl. Never forget that, okay? Wendy nodded slightly before her gaze shifted and she took a step behind him warily. Company. Of course there is, Laxus growled out, turning just in time to see the form of one of the Spriggan 12. If you're here to fight I'm not, Jin said, his gaze ignoring them all as he walked straight towards God Serena's body and knelt down beside it. Staring at the man's dead face, he sighed for a moment before reaching out and closing the man's eyes. Rest well, Serena. And thank you. Getting back to his feet, Jin raised his hands up in a show of faith. No weapons. I left any I had back over the way I came. I'm the one responsible for saving all of your lives too, if that helps. And how do we know you're telling the truth? He is, Taoshiro said, resting against his sword as he watched Jin warily. He was with God Serena when they came to talk with us at the wreckage of the Genesis. He's a poison god slayer. Still doesn't mean we should be trusting him. The enemy of enemy does not always make them our friend. Zeref just proved that. Luckily I'm no ally of Zeref's then, Jin joked before glancing down seriously at God Serena's corpse. I'm sure you must have realized it from Zeref's actions. God Serena was one of his strongest warriors, but anything less than unshakable loyalty isn't good enough for Zeref. I don't know when he realized, but the moment Acknowledge died, any usefulness God Serena and I had to him was gone. The death of Acknowledge was the entire reason we joined up with them officially. You're a god slayer. If you hated Acknowledge so much, why'd you learn that magic? Let's just say some of us can't afford to be picky. I took what I could get. I had to. But that doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what comes next. Zeref is beginning to move and I have crucial information that has to reach Juushiro's ears after these events. Juushiro's? You mean the previous magic chairman We were his spies, Jin confirmed. You should be aware of how Juushiro operates. He used your best friend for many years. For us it was similar. We both wanted to kill Acknowledge, and Juushiro helped grant us the tools to do so. Once Alvarez started making larger and larger moves, he realized he needed a way to keep an eye on the situation, and so he sent me. Once I learned about their desire to kill Acknowledge, it was easy to then bring God Serena into the fray and create an excuse, all the while leaking information back to Juushiro. Enemy actions, force numbers, commanders, and their abilities, and much more. It gave him enough to be ready when this war came to at least get the barrier activated in time. Unfortunately, events have deviated from what we initially expected, Jin added quickly. I'm sure most of you aware of what Ukin are. Even with Ichigo and the other Nonukin leaving the continent, Juushiro wasn't worried because we had God Serena still. But I got a bit reckless and played our hand too early, sending Juushiro our coordinates to Fire Ethereon, and resulting in confirming Zeref's own suspicions. Wait, it was you that got that super weapon to fire at us. It almost worked too. Acknowledge was more resilient than expected. After that I had to wait ages until he let his guard down, and the only time he ever did that was when he truly believed he had won. Just cut to the case already, Gajeel called out. What's Zeref planning? You have an idea, right? Certainly, Jin replied. He'll march towards Magnolia and kill everyone in his path. He may even use his demons at this point if he decides to abandon the mask of Emperor. What's worse is that his forces have already been mobilizing and have been attacking while you've all been fighting. What? That bastard, Natsu growled out. Was he playing us from the start? That's why I need you to take me to Juushiro as quickly as possible, Jin stated. For some reason I can't get through to him with archive magic, which means it's likely a certain someone is actively trying to mute my magic. They know that I know too much but they can't change their plans now mid-fight so they'll just push on through. But if you can get me to Juushiro, I can tell you everything. Including where their regrouped army will be a day from now once they regroup inside the barrier. Laxus felt his blood drain away from his face. The barrier's gone. Ah yes. Maybe I should have started with that. If my estimates are correct, the forces of Ishgar should have been forced into full retreat. Protector of the Fairies. Freeing the King of the Stars. This is weird, Ichigo muttered to himself, his eye moving back and forth between as he eyed each corridor leading away from him warily. The silence was unnerving, especially when he had sensed that foul presence not even a floor ago. The further he went down, the more that presence could be drowned out. Magic was down here, somehow surviving in the heart of all these magical barrier particles, and there was enough of it to keep this place as a bubble of sorts. However, that in itself was suspicious. Baragan's presence was suffocating to everything around them. This wasn't a place where magic was able to thrive, and yet for there to be this much staying stable down here was unheard of. And if there was still magic down here, there could easily be people too. Those loyal to Zeref could have taken shelter in the depths and just gotten lucky enough to have this bubble keeping them sane, and his appearance so suddenly like this could easily be taken as a sign of aggression. For all they knew, he could be coming down here to finish them all off. Which was why he was doing his best to try and look out for anyone still alive down here. So far he hadn't seen any signs, and as much as he'd like to investigate further he simply did not have the time. Not when every second was a second the others had to deal with the twisted being above. At the very least he was sure one of his questions would be answered. The source of this bubble seemed to be getting closer. Zeref's directions from before they had even left for Alvarez had been vague enough as it was, but he had a good feeling that he'd find both if he kept going towards the source of this energy. His right eye almost seemed to confirm it. Every so often he got a flash of something. It wasn't a second ahead, he knew that because he didn't even recognize where he was. It had happened enough times now that he had managed to piece some things together about what he was seeing, and he thought he could see pipes, and even a person, though he couldn't tell if they were alive or not. Other times he merely saw stone brick, and one time he even saw the open sky. It was certainly odd trying to put it all together, but he could take a bit of comfort in the fact that it wasn't him causing this. Passively he only ever saw a second ahead, and since losing Mavis his vision in his right eye had dimmed. Without the connection it was impossible for the magic to be maintained, which meant every vision he got now was a result of her reaching out for him. Whatever was happening upstairs had to be helping her, and even if the connection was only able to be restored for such brief moments it was still helping to guide him on his path. Reaching a crossroads, he glanced down both ways before managing to recognize part of the path to the right and immediately rushing down it. Bit by bit he was finding the paths from these visions, though he wished he knew how far each was ahead. They just kept arriving jumbled up, and to Mavis who saw time in such a different way he was sure it was easy to read. For him, not so much. Thanks Mavis, he muttered quickly as another vision filled his right eye, the sight he saw quickly found as he continued the way he was going. He wasn't sure if she could heard him while doing this but he hoped she could. I'll be there soon, he added, in what he hoped sounded reassuring rather than worried. She'd just get anxious if she realized how worried he was. He was almost at the source of the magic when another vision of something appeared before him, a monstrous sight causing him to freeze in place at the mere sight of it. His breath caught in his throat for a moment until he realized he recognized the monstrosity. It was Baragan. How far ahead was that in the future? He was used to seeing into the next moment but that looked quite a bit further. Was Mavis trying to warn him? That sounded like her, but for her to show him that had to have some level of importance. He pushed his thoughts of the vision to one side briefly as he noticed he had managed to arrive at his destination, along with the answer to why this place was so saturated with magic. There was a magic furnace down here. Not even a small one, but one large enough to rival that of the Genesises. He'd even dare to say it was larger, which certainly explained a lot. Very few magic furnaces could even hope to produce this much magical power, let alone the magic it had likely generated that he couldn't sense, lost to the magical barrier particles in their constant clash. This couldn't be here by chance. Something like this could have turned one of Ziref's airships into a deadly flagship, capable of firing the strongest weapons imaginable. But instead it was down here, in this room hidden below the seat of Ziref's rule. If it was here, it meant there was something here that required this much power. But what? He looked down and got his answer. Immediately he wished he hadn't, and for the first time in a long while he saw a sight that almost made him throw up. "Kill me. You're still alive," Ichigo muttered in horror. "God, what is this?" This was certainly the man he had gotten a glimpse at briefly in some of those visions. Only he was realizing quickly how little he had managed to truly take in upon seeing this. What once looked like it was a full head of a hair was reduced to small patches, what little remained looking like it was about to fall off too if it was even touched. The man's skin looked hollow, with sunken cheeks on his face and limbs with so little fat on them that there was almost no gap between the flesh and the bones. His clothes looked like they had once been well made, but now they were nothing but rags on him. Chains bound the man to the wall, the man's wrists and ankles caked with dried blood as if he had tried to tear his body free at any cost. They didn't even allow him room to stretch out, pressing him tightly against the wall. It was inhuman, but it was the wires and tubes that made it worse. Across the exposed patches of flesh of his arms there were dozens and dozens of wires, piercing his skin at seemingly random points. They all lead back to the same source, right above where the poor man had been chained to. "They're pumping you full of magic." It explained some of what he was seeing, but it didn't make it any less horrifying. The body had a natural rate it absorbed magic in. A Nukin could override, even if there were risks to do so for too long, and it was as easy as breathing. But that was because magic was actively assisting in the process. Quincy came closest to replicating their skill, but it wasn't the same. This was a pale attempt of imitating even that. Day after day, week after week, this man had likely had his magical power forcefully restored at a rapid rate, ignoring his body's own protests and pushing it to its very limits as fast as possible. For the man's body to have not broken down yet meant this was just barely controlled, but it also meant he had been exhausting an equal amount of magical power to what he had been forcefully absorbing. What kind of spell required a magic furnace to keep the user from running dry? It sounded like one only practically usable by a Nukin. He froze, gears slowly clicking into place as he realized just who would have placed this man down here and who had even told them about how to free their fellow brethren. "The seal is a human," he muttered softly, looking down at the man in pity now as he finally understood what Ziref had done. "You're keeping the celestial spirit king contained, aren't you? No wonder Ziref did this to you. The effort alone should have depleted all your magical power. So Ziref hooked you up to this monstrosity to keep you filled with magic, regardless of whether you wanted this or not." There was one thing he didn't understand though. Why haven't you stopped? This spell is yours, right? Please, kill. The man barely seemed to hear him, begging for death. Ziref hadn't even allowed the man the chance to take that escape, ridding him off all possibilities. There was even a tube going into the man's mouth, one he suspected was used to forcefully feed him to keep him from starving himself. He wasn't going to get any answers from this man. And from looking at him he had a feeling the man wouldn't get better either just from being freed. There was no telling of how Ziref's methods had damaged him beyond what he could see on the surface. This man just wanted it all to end. Drawing his smaller Zanpakuto, he quickly stabbed it forward into the man's heart and allowed him that one wish he still had. A gasp left the man's lips before he thought he could hear some relief as the man took his last breaths. By the time he drew his sword back out, the man was gone, leaving a still warm corpse behind. Across the corpse he briefly saw runes bursting to life, glowing brightly for a moment before shifting shattering. Some of them looked somewhat familiar and they could have very well been the reason the man couldn't just cancel his spell. It wouldn't be surprising if Zeref had added them to ensure nothing would go wrong. Zeref. Just thinking of that bastard made him want to tear this whole place apart. The man had known he'd find this. Even if he hadn't been able to know who would go down and find the man, the knowledge would have always ended up getting into his hands. But he was sure Zeref had been hoping he'd find this place. Was Zeref proud of this? Of warping a man's life so much that he was reduced to a mere conduit for a spell of some kind? That treating people humanely was an afterthought that hardly needed to be considered? He did his best to rein in his temper by slashing out at the magic furnace with his blade, letting a small wave of energy smash against it and detonate the whole thing in one large inferno. A wave of magic washed against him, but he batted most of it away with another swing. It helped deal with some of that rage, but seeing Zeref again would probably reignite it. At the very least there was now nothing that should be keeping the Celestial Spirit King restrained. Now all he had to do was meet up with the others and what the... As he turned to leave, he found the very space had changed. What had once been a stone corridor now opened up all around him to wide open space, bright stars, and planets demanding his full attention as he came to a stop on a floating pathway that hardly felt like it should be able to be suspended like it was. "I really hope you aren't trapped here too, my friend." He knew that voice. As quickly as he could he turned towards the voice, the large form of the Celestial Spirit King bringing a happy smile to his face. "Well, you're a sight for sore eyes. Thank God something has gone right today." "I'll take that as a no then," said the Celestial Spirit King with a chuckle. "I have to say, it's nice to have a chance of company." "Hey!" shouted Zera in outrage. "What's wrong with me?" "Nothing, dear Zera. But when we know each other as well as we do, it can become quite hard to find new things to discuss when we lack any form of outside stimulus. Speaking of which, how long has it been, Ichigo? It's hard to judge time when one can't look out and see at what rate it has been passing at." "A bit over a month." "Ah," said the Celestial Spirit King, letting out a long sigh. "That long, huh? Unfortunately. Things have been rough to say the least." The Celestial Spirit King nodded, looking down at him sadly. "I can tell. You look like you have aged greatly. Was Zeref to blame?" Ichigo nodded. "In part. As was Waiwak. But mostly. Baragan almost won. Not by winning the war, but he almost managed to make me destroy myself." "I see. You will have to tell me more when we have time. I'm just glad he failed, and I am truly sorry you have had to deal with this all alone. I was foolish and took on Alvarez far too recklessly. I didn't realize until too late that the mysterious Spriggan and Zeref were one and the same. If I had known, I would have realized that it was a trap from the start. He played all of us. It's not your fault. Even so, I still hold the blame for that." The Celestial Spirit King let out another sigh, this one of disappointment. "I suppose you are curious of what happened." Ichigo shrugged. "I suppose I am a bit, though we are short on time." "We have some currently," the Celestial Spirit King revealed. "I didn't mean for you to end up dragged into my world. Rather, something must have happened on your end that loosened the restraints holding me in place. My magic is currently breaking away the last shackles holding it in place and trying to expand fully once more, though something is interfering. That will probably be the magical barrier particles." "Magical barrier particles?" The giant's brow quickly furrowed. "I think I can sense what you mean. I'll try and pull my world back then instead of allowing it to expand." "You have some explaining to do too, it seems." "Yeah," Ichigo muttered. "Not all of it is good. You want to go first?" The giant nodded. "Very well. To begin with, I assume your knowledge on space magic is still lacking in areas. Even if it wasn't, I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be helpful anyway when it comes to your magic." "Fair enough," chuckled the Celestial Spirit King. "Magic that alters space typically interfere with one another, similar to what occurs when different forms of time magic interact. With most space-based magic, they rarely overlap at the same time. However, when space magic begins warping the surroundings themselves, things get more complex. You could imagine there being a hierarchy of sorts. And I reign at the summit." Zera stated proudly from one of the Celestial Spirit King's shoulders, holding a hand up in the air triumphantly. Whenever someone tries to enact their rules, I said screw them and force my own in place. A bit cruder than I would have said it, replied the giant she was standing on, but fitting enough I suppose. Her magic, spatial aurora, is the greatest of all magic of space manipulation. This entire world is a product of it, the greatest work she can produce. No matter what other similar magic is being used, this world will overwrite it all and the world itself, at least so long as it remains deployed. No space magic can compete, that is certain true. My mistake was forgetting they can interfere. I don't know who did it, the Celestial Spirit King added, but someone out there had a magic that reacted to my spell. If they had tried to activate their magic earlier, mine would have undoubtedly crushed their authority of control. But since they waited until I had unleashed my full power, they were able to wrap it all with their own authority. There was likely a rule of some kind that helped lock us down. Tricky magic like this always tends to be linked with runes or curses, but the fact is that it was capable of locking us away in our own created world, incapable of dismissing it or deploying a new one to try and escape. All we could do was resign ourselves to waiting for the spell to end, though it took a bit longer than I was hoping. I found the caster. He was hardly what I'd call alive by this point. Zeref wasn't kind. I figured he'd have a role in this, the giant muttered gravely. He freed me, and yet it makes sense he only did that knowing how to trap me again. So, what's your story? And where's Mavis? Zara asked, leaping down and coming to a stop in the air a few feet before she would have hit the ground. I don't see her anywhere. Is she hiding somewhere? If she was anywhere in this world I'd sense her. But I don't. Not even in you. She paused briefly, her eyes narrowing at him as her gaze slowly alternated between his right eye and the golden knife he held. That feels like Mavis. Hell, you even feel a bit like Mavis. Where is she? And what did you two do? That's a bit of a long story. Then summarize it. Ichigo shrugged before reaching up to the dim light at his right eye. We found Mavis's real body. The gods of Ishgar had been keeping it safe for her, and as a result I was able to put her essence back into her true body. But her power isn't really one we can typically use to fight with. One of the gods of Ishgar, Aoesu, offered us his assistance in. I guess you could call it modifying a part of her. And before you have a go at me, she was the one you pressured me into accepting. Sounds like her, Zara muttered. So what? You took a part of her and weaponized it. And a part of me, Ichigo said, correcting her assumption. An eye for an eye. It wasn't much flesh that either of us gave up. But bonded through the process of Aoesu's Zanpakuto forging, it created the dagger I'm holding and strengthened our connection. You can glimpse into time, can't you? The Celestial Spirit King muttered. Shortening the distance between the wielder and the magic. Not many could do that, so I have to say I'm impressed at this man's work. Have you ever considered doing the same? The Celestial Spirit King shook his head. Zara's lacrima resides in my sword, but that sword is nothing special. To do what you'd suggesting would require fusing the lacrima with my flesh, which has never really been something I thought about. Plus it just sounds weird to me, Zara added on afterwards. Maybe it's because there's so little of my physical form, but I can't imagine giving up a single part of it. Guess Mavis has that benefit, what having a human form and all. Careful now, Zara. You sound jealous. Maybe a bit. Though it would make me a bigger target. Oh, that's what happened. You catch on quick, Ichigo muttered. What gave it away? The fact she's not here, Zara answered immediately. Physical differences aside, internally we're fairly similar. Once we find someone we wish to wield our power, we're pretty stubborn on sticking with them. And even more so at getting them back. There's no way she would leave your side willingly. She seemed to love hanging off you when she was just a spirit, and I doubt that would change much because she can interact with the rest of the world. And since I'm assuming we're in the heart of enemy territory, there is no way you'd leave her alone. Neither would you let her get too far away when she's what everyone is fighting for. Ichigo nodded briefly. Right, on all accounts. We did get separated briefly. I was fighting Baragan and I didn't want to have her caught up in the battle. Even so, she was close enough that I could have reached her if necessary. That was until she was caught by surprise by a member of Avatar and abducted. Avatar? I don't quite remember them, the Celestial Spirit King mused. Who are they allied with? Mimi Heiji. The giant froze, his eyes widening in horror. His mouth opened and closed a few times as he struggled to find the words he wished he was after. Ah, he said after finally regaining his voice. Explains the magical barrier particles. Yeah. To cut that short, Baragan was revived by them through some means and changed into a thing. I'm not sure exactly, I haven't seen him yet. Or have I think but only in a vision from Mavis. This energy though, it's all of him. We're in the heart of Alvarez's capital and it's a city of death. Anukin wielding magical barrier particles, the giant whispered terrified. You are here for my help aren't you? Yeah. Then you have it. Such a foe is not one any of us can fight alone. Are there others dash? Every Ukin we could find except for Ziref and God Serena, who are meant to be dealing with Acknowledge back at Ishgar. Their priorities are skewed, the Celestial Spirit King muttered, frowning in annoyance. Does that mean we have Wywak here? He was one of the ones who sought the rest of us out. Apparently there is no future past today. Or if there is then it isn't one he can see. Then there is not a moment to waste. Getting to his feet, the Celestial Spirit King brought an arm out to one side and summoned his sword to his side. My world will soon finish retreating. Allow me to clear a path. I just need to go after the foulest source of energy correct. Be careful, Ichigo stated. Mavis is in his grasp, protected by Fairy Sphere admittedly but I don't want to press her luck until she's safely away from his grasp. If she has all the power of Lumen Histoire at her disposal and the magic it requires then her barrier should at least hold. As the fastest of all of us you should stick to my shadow and lunge in when the chance arises. Sometimes tells me Baragan, even in this state, won't be happy to see you. Protector of the fairies. Where was she? How long had it been? Had it been hours? Or had it been days? For someone like her, isolation was the worst kind of pain imaginable. Especially now, trapped within her own magic in order to save herself from the malevolent force right outside those golden walls. She knew who that was. It was Baragan, though now in a state she remembered him being. But how much of that hollow remained was unclear. He could speak but he never truly interacted with her. Rather his words tended to be uttered like he was stuck on a loop. A hate that had followed him to the grave, and had then continued to follow him right back to his resurrection. She hadn't been witness to how this happened but she knew it was Avatar's doing. The magical barrier particles that had surrounded her had given it away, always trying to eat away at her barrier, and had only scattered once. That was when she had first gotten a look at Baragan, right as he slaughtered the very cultists that brought him back. If she could have she would have tried to flee, but the moment his gaze had landed on her she had frozen up. He had recognized her, even if he hadn't acknowledged it verbally, and since then he had taken her with him as he went. She heard the screams and occasionally had even gotten a glimpse out through the times when the magical barrier particles shifted away from part of her barrier but most of the time she had to piece everything together from the chaos she could only guess was occurring. A city fell and she hadn't even the slightest idea of what city it was, or even what continent it was in. Things had settled for a bit but in the darkness only lit by her barrier's light, there was little she could do. Her inability to reach out to the outside world left her unable to grasp the moment in time she was in, and her mind found it easy to simply fall into a deep slumber as she waited, tugging at a connection that still extended beyond the reach of the magical barrier particles. Wherever he was, Ichigo would know she was still alive. Just as she knew he was still alive. She hoped he could find her but without any indication from the bond she had no idea how far. All she could do was be patient. Her barrier was being constantly eroded, and she could only absorb the tiniest amounts of magical power whenever the deadly energy shifted a bit, so she had to hope the vast amount of magical power stored within her body would be enough for as long as it would take. Still, it had dropped down a significant amount. At most she had to have around a tenth of her total reserves, but it was probably much lower. The only time she had ever had her magical power drop this low was actual she couldn't remember when. Despite her ability, her experience on traversing large periods of time was much lower than people would expect. If she had gone on long trips she simply didn't remember them. A brief bit of light drew her from her thoughts, not coming from her barrier, and she immediately pressed herself against the edge in order to peer out before she lost the chance. Instinctively she reached out for the bond and found it responding, even if just for a moment. She felt something. An emotion maybe? She wasn't sure what she sent back, but the mere knowledge that she could reach Ichigo again meant he was here, close enough for her to reach him once more even with this much magical barrier particles present. Then the presence shut off once more as the magical barrier particles fell back into place. She almost thought she had imagined it all, until they shifted once again and allowed her another chance. It happened multiple times, and each time she desperately clung onto the bond for as long as she could, screaming into it as loud as she could to hurry to her side. Her voice felt hoarse by the end of it. She hadn't needed to say the words. Thinking would have sufficed. But she had felt herself uttering them regardless. Was this because she was growing used to having a physical body again and didn't have to rely on talking mentally as much? Perhaps. A large mass of magical barrier particles shifted this time and her eyes managed to catch sight of someone beyond the veil. Immediately she had thrown herself back against the other side of the barrier, and had never been so happy to be plunged back into darkness when the energy retreated back in. That was Waiwak. Why? Why was he here? Did Ichigo know? Was Waiwak in on this? Was it a trap? 100 thoughts raced through her mind before she forced herself to calm down. She had seen Warod briefly, so there was no way this could be a trap. Not if Warod was involved. There had been others too. Familiar faces even. She thought she had seen the other gods of Ishgar present, and even that monk. But working together with Waiwak? She kind of wished she could be seeing things from their side if only to get an idea of why they had allied themselves together. In her position, anything with magical barrier particles seemed like a threat, regardless of how powerful they were in reality. Still, where was Ichigo? She could sense him, but where was he? Above? Below? Perhaps he was hiding for the moment. Considering who his enemy was, it wasn't the worst idea. With all the hate Baragan seemed to feel, he'd hunt him down with all his might if given the chance. Well, she supposed she'd simply have to wait. If Ichigo was here, then she didn't have to worry much about herself. Just worry about the kind of mess he'd get himself into in order to save her. Protector of the fairies. Twisting his staff around, Warod slammed the end into the ground and caused the seeds he had scattered around to sprout, bringing forth a small forest right on top of the monstrous form of Baragan. The giant trunks of newly formed trees slammed straight into the mist, protecting him, only to start dissolving away moments later as the very life within them was eaten away, magic and all. Leaping from one decaying branch to another, Hyborian pushed his body to its limits, narrowly avoiding streams of magical barrier particles as they burst out in random directions. With a flick of his wrist against his teeth, he allowed it to be sliced open, blood filling the air before his magic burst to action. Every drop moved according to his will, reshaping into stakes that he quickly launched straight through the gaps created as the creature they were facing attacked. Only one made it through, but Baragan didn't even let out a noise of pain before sweeping away the rest of the forest with one wipe sweep of his hand, forcing Hyborian back as he hurried to outrace the energy trying to grab onto him. Before it could reach him, Aoesu leapt in front of the energy's path, the sword he wielded slicing one and parting the energy around them. It tried to alter its course, but another slice cut off its attempts. The energy tried to linger across the blade as Aoesu pulled back, but it failed to find any grip on the sharp blade. Back up. Waiwak, force an opening. I don't appreciate being ordered about, said Waiwak calmly, swinging out his sword and unleashing a wave of controlled energy against the nearby magical barrier particles and letting the two attacks devour one another. But if an opening is what you desire. Leaping upwards, he quickly sailed out of reach of Baragan's range before holding out one hand, a giant bow of energy forming before him. The string moved with but a thought, the arrow to strike with being formed as it was pulled back. Even if Baragan had the sense to try and stop him, he wouldn't have been fast enough. The arrow, a quarter of the width of the tower, shot forth and slammed straight into Baragan's monstrous form. Almost all of the energy was eaten away by the magical barrier particles that still clung closely to his body, but it was enough to force open a gap, wounds being left across the creature's body. However, they were quickly beginning to heal as more magical barrier particles began to flow freely from his wounds. Ichibe quickly struck while he had the chance. his weapon, looking nothing more than a long brush with a blade attached at the end. As he stepped in, Baragan instinctively moved back to avoid the blade. The ink released from the brush as it swung through its arc wasn't something the creature could easily avoid, however, some of it splattering against his exposed flesh. The monk could only scowl when he watched the flesh itself get eaten away by the magical barrier particles, allowing the true surface of bones to be shown to them. "My magic can't settle," he called out as he backed away, narrowly avoiding an attempt from Baragan to catch him in its grasp. "But he's trying to take on a human appearance again. I'll try and break that focus to buy us some more time." "You sure him taking human form is dangerous?" Warod called out warily. "For an Arankar, they tend to be more dangerous when they stop looking like a hollow. Whatever he looks like normally, I doubt this is it. The magical barrier particles are trying to convert him completely into Mimihagi's desired host, and Baragan doesn't even appear to be resisting. He's got no reason to," Wywak stated as he dropped down to their level. "Not so long as Ichigo is not yet here. I can guarantee that Baragan's will is unlikely to even flicker when that happens." "You plan to use him as bait, I assume?" asked Hibarian before he let out a sigh of defeat. "Our options are limited, so it may be the best option we have available. At least we will have additional aid so long as the Celestial Spirit King is willing to fight. I knew it would be hard to harm Baragan, but our attacks can barely make it through his defenses. Which is why we need to stop him now," Ichibe pointed out. "If we let him be assimilated, then we'll have Mimihagi to deal with, and he will be far worse than this monster. Wywak, we will go with your plan. Until then, let us dash." Ichibe paused as their enemy froze in place. Even the energy around them came to a halt, as if frozen in time, while an odd emotion crossed Baragan's face. "Kuro. Saki. He knows." Warod called out as they all leapt away, a mass of magical barrier particles smashing into the whole floor. Through the mist he briefly saw Baragan beginning to move towards a large hole he'd made and quickly shouted out a warning. "He's trying to escape." He must have sensed Ichigo. "Hang on," Aoyasu called, bringing his sword up ready. "I'll stop him." Before he even could, Baragan was blasted upwards as a pillar of energy shot forth from deep below the ground, taking the whole tower with it and turning it into a mass of scattering rubble. The others quickly dodged each piece with ease, keeping an eye on Baragan's form as he was flung higher into the sky before a form of someone even larger shot up, his cape blowing in the wind. "Meteor Blade!" the giant shouted out, his sword swinging down and cleaving straight through Baragan's left side and forcing enough of the magical barrier particles to scatter to reveal a golden orb. In that moment a black blur shot forward towards it, and at the same time Baragan let out a loud roar as his eyes locked onto the same individual that was charging towards him. Kurosaki, Protector of the Fairies. Check the description for the links to the author.